Doctor, how you doing, Philippe? You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm done. Not too bad. Yeah.
Oh,
How
good.
about you, Daniel? How are
I'm
you?
doing fine. I'm doing fine. It's gotten really hot in Virginia, and but the weed eating didn't quite kill me, so that was good. And no, we're doing good. Unfortunately, I thought we were going to have a bunch of green peppers, and it looks like a groundhog decided to eat them all last night. So that's what it. Yeah, exactly. What you do is you take some Iris Spring soap and you scrape off shards of it in the garden, and the smell keeps them off. And lo and behold, I forgot to do it last night.
Yeah, so that was gonna happen. So
Yeah.
you have a farm there, do you?
Yes, sir. We live on a farm in central Virginia. It's actually been it was my grandfather, so and I grew up on it actually. We live in my grandparents' old house.
Do you live off the farm?
We're a small farm.
Yeah. But is it enough to feed yourselves, or
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
it? Yeah,
Yes, sir.
that's nice.
So,
That's lovely.
if everything goes to crap because inflation gets out of control, you just got to get across the ocean, Philippe. So
Yeah,
we
just
will
gotta
have
get across this tiny pond in the
this
way. Other
little
than that,
pond. You just swim
yeah.
or whatever, it'll work out. But no,
Oh, what we used to do back in the day.
oh, back in the day. No, we have so many tomatoes. Michelle right now is actually blanching the tomatoes, and that's what you do is you boil a pot of water, you put tomatoes, then you put them in bags and you mash them and you can freeze them. You can do like tomato soup, tomato sauce, a lot of stuff like that. I like tomatoes. So we'll have a few sandwiches. But so we've been growing that. So yeah, if you get across the ocean, we can get you through a few months of tomato soup. We got plenty of tomato soup, Dr. Nicholas. We'll get you on through.
Oh, that's great. I'd love to be a part of that. Yeah. So
That
it sounds like you got a pretty busy life.
Oh, we make it happen. Once the
How do
kids
you
get,
how do you get any space to think these, heavy duty intellectual matters?
I've always for work and money done blue collar things. Because I like while I'm doing it to think about things. Like when I'm weed eating, I'm kind of thinking about things. And I
Hmm.
find that the blue collar work, since it's not a job that say demands your intellect. Yeah, you got to focus. Yeah, you got to think, but it's not say um, using up your intellectual faculties throughout the
Right.
day. And I
Yeah.
find that works out nice because then I find since there's only a limited amount of time in the day, the name of the game is to get the most out of the time you can get, which means when you
Hmm.
get your, say, if I try right now since we've been doing so much editing, which my eyes almost bled out of my head, but we somehow got through. I've had a later schedule, but when I'm like writing things, it tends to be 5 to about 7 or 8 before going to work. And so the key is to make sure that those 3 hours are very focused and high
Yeah.
quality,
Yeah.
because you can't expand the time. And actually, I find by just not having, say, a job or a career that is mentally demanding, then when you get that time, you use it very well. So I
Mm.
different strategies like that. I guess also I've learned that if me personally, now this doesn't apply to everyone because I know other people it's the exact opposite. I find once I eat, my brain almost turns off. So I try to wait to eat before I go into blue collar work because then it doesn't matter, right? So if I'm going to start doing blue collar work at like
Yeah.
8, then I eat at like 7:30.
Yeah.
Because then you have the energy to do that. Whereas when you want to focus on the intellectual work, I actually find less food is better. Now, I know people, it's the exact opposite. So I was always taken, I think it was Jonathan Edwards in one of his journals. He actually recorded everything he ate for like a month to figure out when he ate what and how that activated his ability to think. And that always stuck with me. That paying attention to how eating affects what kind of work you can do, rather blue collar or intellectual. And then the other thing that always stuck with me is when Benjamin Franklin taught himself to write by copying verbatim newspapers and how he did that for years to get to the place where he could think in a kind of structured literary way. And I always use that like when we do our fiction, if I want to do a piece that has kind of a Faulkner style, I find going back through Faulkner and actually copying verbatim just for myself passages out of his books helps you get in the mode of that writing style. And
Hmm.
also it helps you remember the text. So likewise, if you wanted something that would be more like a Don DeLeo, something more that would be like in that sort of genre, it's a more modern, then you would go and read that and kind of copy it out and almost get it into your blood. So those I always associate those in my head, maybe because I just encountered them at the same time as sort of little tricks of the trade.
Yeah. It's marvelous how just writing something down, whatever it is you're doing, and piling it up over time just gives you this deep perspective over what you've actually been doing.
Absolutely.
Because if you just remember it, memory has had the tendency to, sugarcoat things and compress things, right? Which is good for other things to be efficient and whatnot. But if you want a good idea of what you've actually done in the time, just writing it down is great. What you actually ate or what you actually did, how you actually spent your time. I don't see that as a good way of doing things, like ultimately, but as a kind of nice reflective exercise from time to time to as an investigation. I find that's pretty fruitful.
No, for me, it's kind of like a phase thing. Like you do that for a period of time, and then you learn that, and then you go from there once you kind of find what it is, and maybe every now and then revisit it or think about it. In the same way that I used to be an obsessive note taker, like I'd carry around a notebook and write down everything I thought. I think that was a valuable phase, but then you can actually get to the place where you're just writing down everything, and it's not, but then you get to the place where your brain, I think, gets in the habit of thinking in terms of capturing or remembering. And so it's useful to get you through that. But eventually, actually, you can just have notebooks upon notebooks upon notebooks of stuff. And then it's too much to even sort through. So it's good to go through a phase. But it's funny how I agree with you. There actually has to be kind of this movement. Well, in the same way as in doing poetry, there's something extremely valuable of thinking about compression, thinking about density, thinking about ways to word things and how particular wordings, even if two sentences have the same meaning, the particular wording transforms it. It's not the same. Well, a lot of people treat language just as something almost you go through. You don't treat it as like an art form in of itself. You don't think you just say what you want to say. You don't really think, naturally it's easy not to think about how you say it. Whereas just spending that time to do the poetic work transforms your relationship to language in ways that I think is extremely useful. And then you carry that with you as you go and do other things.
Yeah, like my old supervisor used to characterize the world of Hegel's logic is that it's a thing we inhabit, right? It's something we like swim in, something that, our world is made up of, and without which we wouldn't have the kind of experiences we are having. So yeah, language is like this.
Oh, that's beautiful how you put it. I was watching your talk with Guy, where Mr. Sinstock, where you were kind of mentioning the certain mode that one goes into Hegel and kind of thinking about it as something that you're in. Whereas so often in education, I know I've made this mistake. So often you're taught to think that reading is just something you do, and you did it. It just happens. You read through the sentences and that's it. And if you understood it, it was well written. And if you don't understand it, it's the writer's fault. That's how we're kind of trained to think, when actually very often it's the exact opposite. But there's this educational impression where if you don't get it when you read it, well, then it's useless. And that's actually bad, because then you never swim. You never put yourself in it because you're always skimming over it per se.
Yeah. Although now I would say that it's not so much we that enter into them, it's them entering into us.
Yeah,
and showing us how we get deeper into ourselves.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
when Hegel or Spinoza or great philosopher, poet, what have you, right? When they grip you, it's like they're showing you a side of you that you always knew was there, but nobody just hadn't pointed it out to you yet, right?
Absolutely.
And it's familiar and alien at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, the notion of kind of entering, in my mind, when I say that, I have this kind of going in a cathedral kind of thing. Like, it's like it envelopes you. And in that sense, like it is this funny way where you enter it, but then you find it's entered you because it's transformed your internal operations, and you're suddenly not in the same place as you were internally or externally once you enter into that text. I actually like your language, as you say it, because letting them enter into you has more of an emphasis on the humility aspect, on the getting yourself out of the way, almost not in a kind of like not being involved, but in a opening, like making yourself a clearing so that they can enter you and have that transformative impact on you. As you speak, because very often we think of books as something we read as opposed to things that enter us. The agency in our language is indeed very much on us. When really, a more humble language is better, actually, now that you say that.
Well, it doesn't exclude the outer entering into another, right? But yeah, I think it's as is all truthful things. it's usually a bit twisted, right? You go into
Right.
them as they go into you
Right.
even more.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think most things have that, like you say, twisted or doubleness, bothness to it, which then that one of the whole reasons thinking is challenging is because thinking does not naturally think in terms of a bothness, but an either or. And one of the reasons you have to engage in the thinking of thinking is to get into a habit where you stop naturally doing that, where you get into the place where every time you go, oh, I'm entering into a book, you go, wait, hold on. Yes, that's true. But they're also entering into me. That sort of, it's interesting how it's that seems always seems to me that something like you have to think about how thinking presents text to you to realize that there's a bothness, and that if you never
Right.
do that, then you don't get that double element.
Yeah, as Hegel puts it at the beginning of the Phenomenology, it's if ordinary consciousness, the everyday person down the street, if they're presented that with philosophy, right? It's like asking them to walk upside down,
Oh yeah.
right? It's so strange what it is we're doing in intellectual businesses that yeah, it's like putting on like uncomfortable clothes.
Mm.
I don't know, maybe that's not the best analogy, but anyway, I think it makes a lot of sense that it's not so rewarding to begin with,
Mm.
right? So thinking in terms of either or, I think has a lot of practical, pragmatic, and evolutionary value, right? All those empirical stuff and things, and I think that's all good. But then philosophy seems to ask us to do something, to do away with that, or to suspend that, or to investigate deeper about why are things working that way, and that asks us to go into this weirdness of having to go upside down for a period of time.
Mm. I think that's beautiful. Walker Percy has this line where he says that in a world where everyone is standing on their head, the only way to show them how to stand straight up is to look like you're standing on your head. And it made me think about what you were saying, how it's kind of like that, where when you ask someone to think about thinking, if we say generally that's something that philosophy is in the business of doing, it's like the weirdest thing in the world because thinking is so often something you think through, not think about. And when you ask someone to think about, it does actually almost feel like getting and standing on your head because there's a spinning element to it. And it's interesting because if one engages though in that act of being willing to think about thinking, just like you mentioned in your video, there are all these things that actually opens up you too that you don't know that it's going to open up to. So I think there's a lot of value in actually doing that, standing on one's head.
So actually, it was an idea that popped into my head as you were talking about these things, and that is that yes, it's weird that we're thinking about thinking, but we're not immersed complete 100% with our situation. We are always getting stuck somehow, or getting repulsed, or finding that our desires are not getting met with adequate satisfaction, or we're getting frustrated by something. And what do we then do? Well, we think about it. What went wrong, right? We try to figure it out, try to solve it. And already there is in its form a thinking about thinking. It's not thinking about thinking explicitly like philosophy is doing it, but there is all this incessant drive in human beings to figure out, well, what really gives me enduring satisfaction. Instead of smoking or drinking, I would want to do things that are more durable and of higher quality. Mill talks about these things, and so I see that. I think we're all like natural philosophers thinking about the form of thought, but then philosophy is actually that discipline that takes that step, that makes it explicit, right? The thinking, as Pippin puts it. Yeah, that is what I want. Wanted to bring out.
I really like that thought. I always find it interesting. Like, so we mentioned Hegel. Like when, Hegel is always starting from things that we all know in the sense of we know we're thinking. We know that we have sense perception. We know that we have experiences,
Oh
and
yeah,
we know
yeah.
that we encounter other people. And it's so interesting because sometimes there's this kind of idea that philosophers just come up with these crazy situations that don't actually have anything to do with reality, when actually very often they just kind of stop and go, you know what? I actually am having a sense experience right now. Well, that's interesting.
What does it mean to have a sense experience?
Why am I,
What
what
is
does
going
it
on?
mean? Yeah, what is
Yeah,
going on?
yeah.
And I
How does it
always,
hang together with these other experiences I'm having?
yeah, because
Yeah.
it's funny because, I would sit around like, we'd be in IHOP at 2 in the morning in high school because that's where all the cool kids went to drink coffee with Aaron and John and Mr. Sherlin. And, we would be talking. And then like one time the waitress, Susan, I believe was her name, was bringing over the coffee. She's like, y'all like to talk about philosophy. And I just remember us all looking at one another and go, oh, I guess that is what we're doing. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people who get into philosophy, in my experience at least, yeah, obviously, one day they go, oh, I like philosophy, but it's almost like they just followed certain questions about experiences they were already having and kind of just asking what followed from that. And then someone else, some other self-conscious, if you went, oh, you like doing philosophy, and you're like, oh, I guess so. And I think that's really an important understanding for where philosophy comes from. Because if you don't, you can get a feeling that these philosophers are just picking out these weird experiences or thought experiments and being difficult, when really they're just asking, what does it mean that this is happening? What does it mean that this is occurring?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really well put. That all these being driven by certain questions that are picked out from situations in your experience, in your life, in your surroundings. That's where it begins. And I think that formally there isn't really a difference between those kind of conversations you're having in the cafe and professional academic philosophers.
That's right.
Or great philosophers. They just do it really well. Right? They're really good at zeroing in on that particular experience, unpacking it as quickly as possible in a way that makes instant sense. I think that's like the mark of the great philosophers. They're really tuned into what's the reality of the real, so to speak. Oh, right? Yeah, they're like, yeah, have you not noticed this? What's going on? Right? This strange thing we're swimming in. Right? What is mind? We're all doing it, but what is it? Can you point it to me? Like you can point to a book or a rock or what have you, right? Well, no. So there's something strange, almost mysterious about this. Like, and another thing about it is like, of all the things we have in the world, philosophy and thinking about these questions, it just seems bottomless, seems infinite, right? And yet it's also so rewarding. The more you do it, the more you get out of it. So if anything is a good investment, forget bonds or the stock market. Philosophy is really, what gives you compounds value over time.
Beautiful. It is, again, for me, one of the things I really like that you said last time is on this idea that in Hegel, and you've said it, you mentioned it with Johannes as well, in this notion that in Hegel, it's a movement of the implicit becoming explicit, like something that was always already, but it's explicit to you. And I was thinking about that, and there's a sense in which, I would have to, write this out. But there's a way in which when Socrates catches people in his dialogues, what he's kind of doing is making the implicit explicit. It's like, because someone's already going to the courtroom. They're already following justice. All he's doing is going, oh, well, what do you mean by justice? What does you mean?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people are being pious. Somebody is being courageous. People have friends, right? All of these things are taking place, occurring. And in a powerful way, the concept in Hegel's technical sense is something that is efficacious, something that's always actual, something that is working. Right? And what we're doing when we're thinking about these things is just, making it explicit. But I agree, it all begins with Socrates and that movement of taking something existing, we're all familiar with, something we think we know, and then let's spell it out. Okay, well, that expression didn't work. We seem to have hit something wrong there. And then we keep on digging. So, like philosophy really needs to have this sort of demonstrative aspect to it. You can't just make statements and say things. You gotta say, okay, well, why? Like you guys were having it again at the cafe, right? You were unpacking. You were trying to figure things out, right?
That's exactly right. Well, so the two things so far that I think is so important to note is that one, philosophy is thinking about the thinking you're already doing. You're already thinking. So what does it lead to? What follows from that? And also, you're always already operating according to what you think is good, what you think is justice, what you think is heroic, and so on and so forth. What Socrates or Hegel does is they come along and say, well, what do you mean by that? What is this thing that you're already doing? And one of the reasons why I think that's so, for me, I guess realizing that has always been very important, because when one can be tempted to think that, say, taking a class on the phenomenology of spirit, such as the one that you will be teaching, does not have any, say, relevance to the practical world. Oh, no, actually, you every single moment of every single day is thinking. You are every single moment of every single day already operating according to certain principles and ideas that you don't even realize are in operation. And to me, another thing that I think about is this question of what is it, in what way does philosophy change you? Because there's this danger of like saying, like a self-help book where for 1999, if you take this philosophy class, you'll have a better marriage and blah, blah, blah. And, Walker Percy has a hilarious book making fun of self-help books. It's so good. It's called Lost in the Cosmos. So it doesn't seem to be like that. And then you also have Hegel warning you. It's like, hey, if you're going to use philosophy to try to make the better world, hold on now, the Owl of Nineveh, let's not be doing that. But then at the same time, there's something about philosophy having a effect on how you interpret things and how you see things, which then in of itself, it's not the practice of, say, lifting up something. It's not the act itself, but it is the interpretation that then changes how you act in the world. That can have that can change things. Would we say, like, if we're talking about, because I've been interested in trying to figure out how to articulate this, that philosophy, it's not so much that it's, say, is practical in the same way that, say, a hammer is practical, but it has a way of transforming how you interpret things so that you see them in a way and therefore carry out your practice better. Because you're practicing through that interpretive lens. Like once you get, for example, that you are always already operating according to certain principles or values, or you're always already thinking, well, then once you interpret yourself as doing thus, then you can engage in the art form better. Now, another reason why, and then I'll hand it to you, another reason why, and I think this is true, another reason why it could be dangerous to think that philosophy is self-help, because philosophy uses, it forces you to go through disillusionment. It forces you to face your ideology. It can have a sort of terrorizing element to it, whereas self-help can kind of be therapeutic, generally speaking, can have a therapeutic. But there is something in precisely that, facing that disillusionment, facing that can have a sort of positive element. I'd be curious how, your thoughts on articulating that, because it's something I think about.
Right.
And,
Okay. Yeah. No, there's a lot of really good thoughts there, Daniel. Thanks so much for that. So I agree with a lot of what you say with regards to what philosophy is doing, except I would take issue with the word interpreting. What we're trying to get a grip on in philosophy is not something that's just up for grabs. So it's just, you can really wonky, do it as you feel it kind of deal. We're trying to figure out objective, truthful matters, like Socrates trying to figure out justice, friendship, not just friendship to this or that particular person, but what is the good friendship? Or like Aristotle with regards to the human mind and the soul and so on. So I think philosophy is striving for more stronger claims and being more invested in these things, because it goes back to what you were saying. Like these are the things that make sense to us in the world, and we inhabit. Right? I think we inhabit a rational world where things work according to a cause and effect principle, and so on and so forth. Right? And we can get tricked by confusing causality with correlation, right? So, philosophy is trying to clarify to ourselves is this practice of clarifying to ourselves, not messing up the concepts and the senses we are working with that, make our day-to-day lives work in a good way. So following up on that, so with regards to Socrates and his dialogues and all that, I feel like there's a lot of scaffolding in their discussions, right? People come with various different suggestions. They show those suggestions not to work, and then they're discarded and then move on to the next thing, right? The difference I see with Hegel is that he doesn't see anything as a scaffolding, right? Everything develops imminently, right? And so there's nothing that gets discarded because it all is part of a development. But even more importantly, often in Hegel, it's like we think we've got the best idea. We think we've got, we now know what morality is. If you just have this, the society is going to work on well. And guess what? No, it actually turns out to be something far worse. It exactly leads us into something worse than what we tried to avoid by getting into this, what we thought was a good thing. And there's a lot of those moments in Hegel. So he's really showing us the dark underbelly of what our desires and drives and ideas can propel us towards. And I think also that's become the job of philosophy, is to expose those things to us, so that we learn from it, right? So that we get instructed. Because this is all, I think, human self-consciousness, trying to figure out, what's what works, what doesn't. And history in its own way is a guide to that. Philosophy does it with pure concepts and so on and so forth. And finally, I agree, philosophy is not self-help because it tries to make objective claims and it tries to do this in a demonstrative way, giving arguments and so on. Self-help just gives you guidance, right? But I think that it is very practically oriented and situationally oriented. And the self-help that is usually good is one that taps into a philosophical core without knowing it.
That's right.
Right? Because it is thinking about a certain problem. That is what we all do all day long, right? Philosophy just takes that to 11 and thinking about problems.
Marvelous. First off, you're exactly right. It's very difficult to use the word interpretation today and it not be relativistic. When people hear interpretation, they hear anything goes. For me, interpretation, there's kind of costly interpretation that you work. Interpretation is something you earn. It's not just kind of an opinion from like a literary standpoint. And interpretation, perhaps I should make a difference between hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation, or you could even say seeing. So when for me to say that there's this interpretative element, it's not to say that it's just an opinion sort of on a whim. It's an earned thing. Actually what got us into a lot of trouble, I think Derrida himself was not saying that a text has infinite interpretation, anything goes. I think what he was trying to say is that texts can have more interpretations than they realize, which was actually to suggest that the authors of the text do not enclose their text as much as they think, which would suggest there are more holes in the argument than they realize, but they will present it as a plan by which we should make the world in the image of, or something like that. And so, there's actually a kind of constructive element where, in that sense, Derrida can be good, but unfortunately, a lot of the deconstructionist, postmodernist thinking has taken interpretation and made it more like an opinion sort of thing, which is not a earned, I always like in his The Cost of Discipleship, I think it is, where Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace and costly grace, and cheap, and I really like that. And so cheap grace is basically in Christianity, you just sin all you want and ask God to forgive you, where costly grace is sort of taking up your cross, trying to do better, knowing that you're a failure, but trying to work more. So likewise for me, there's almost a difference between cheap interpretation, which is just anything goes, and costly interpretation, where you are working so that you can better interpretate. You're always stuck in interpretation, but you can get it better at it. You can do work and interpret better. And philosophy is not at all in the business of cheap interpretation. It is a summons to really do the work of interpretation.
Yeah. That whole movement you just described reminds me of the tribulations of the servant in Hegel's master and slave dialectic, right? Its work becomes one of the important components through which the servant realizes that his or her efforts have like an objective value and something that endures. So, whereas the master is all about immediate satisfaction, the servant comes to learn by not seeking to satisfy themselves, but satisfy another. They nonetheless see something of themselves in the work they do, whether it's building something or preparing a meal or, whatever it is. They've put effort into that, and they can see that effort in front of them. And moreover, they become skilled through doing it. Right. So there's another kind of objective element to it there.
No, that's real. Another document that I started after our last talk is called Hegelian Hermeneutics. And so now I'm going to add the master-slave dialectic, because I love what you said at the end about the plow and Blake and different. I thought that was so good. And there seems to be, like you said, you just used the word skill. There seems to be a skillful interpretation. And there seems to be an interpretation that's just, oh, yeah, that's what I feel, and that is very different. And understand it well. One of the things that actually I think can keep people from getting into philosophy is because if they say, oh, that's just a way of seeing the world. Well, I have my way of seeing the world. You have your way of seeing the world. And together we all see the world in our own unique ways. No.
Well, the first question to ask is, well, how do you know?
Exactly.
I mean, that sounds great. Please tell me about it.
It's funny you say that, so there are, two more things. One of the reasons I actually that really got me, I mentioned the two stories last time, but I'll never forget when it was kind of in high school, middle school, or whatever, and people were saying, oh, it's relative, it's relative here and it's relative there, and for some reason, it was like, well, relative to what? Like if you say, people's opinion is relative, everything is relative. Right? Like people would say that. It was like, well, relative to what? Is that your opinion, or is that objectively the case? And to me, although I did not have the language at the time, that now is clearly a kind of a Hegelian move of showing the destabilizing element in the premise itself, and that it kind of opens up.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that too, because that has always been now something when I encounter an idea or thought, you realize that these, especially when they kind of are totalizing, there's something kind of totalizing about the idea that everything is relative. So it's kind of like the end of the discussion, right?
Yeah.
Premises like that are especially ones where you can find that destabilizing element. And that was also kind of powerful, because then you carry that with you, and when people present things, it changes it. The thing I was also going to say, like when you were mentioning Socrates, one of my favorite things to do that I will do with Haven or the kids is I'll ask them, how was your day? And they'll say, good, because they don't want to talk about it, because no kids do. They want to get back to their sandbox or whatever. Or Haven has a herb garden that he loves, so he wants you to do that. So you ask the questions like, oh, what do you mean by good? And, they'll say, oh, well, nothing bad happened. Oh, so is good a result of nothing bad happening? And they go, well, no, there also has to be a positive element. Okay, like what? And it's funny how even in a statement, what you're doing with the kid is making them realize that even in a simple statement, like today was good, you actually right there have almost like an infinite, like basically an infinity that you can go into. And one of the great one of the great lessons of Socrates or that is to realize, oh my gosh, even the most basic of statements have underneath them an entire world of concepts that you don't even realize are there.
Yeah, it's like Blake put it beautifully, to see the world in a grain of sand.
Grain of sand, yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that too is the other reason I find that people get into philosophy is it's because like once they see that, They can't unsee it.
No, yeah.
And then you get it. And it's like,
Yeah. So yeah, you get, a door's been opened,
that's
and
right.
try as you might, you can't shut it.
Yeah, one of my favorite ways of articulating that at the end of Speak Memory, which was Nabokov's autobiography, he talks about, you know how you have those pictures that have like a secret picture inside of them, like it's small, but then you step far enough back and then you see the whole image, and then once you see the whole image, you can't unsee it anymore. And he talks about, I think it's like something about find the sailor. And he says, once you see the sailor, you can't unsee the sailor. And he says it very articulate at the end of Speak Memory, but I always think about that. And for me, when I go, and maybe that's the word, like this, you can't unsee, instead of interpreting, like I'm trying to find the language, because that's what it's like philosophy does. And it's the same picture, but now that you've seen the sailor hidden in the picture, you can't unsee it. And there's something transformative. There's something that changes in that. And yet it's the same image. The moment you realize that even saying the statement, it was a good day, is like a grain of sand with infinity in it, it's the same statement, and yet it's not the same statement. And there's something so powerful about that moment.
This reminds me of how, basically how development works in Hegel, but it's like the concept is irreversible, right? Physicists complain about nature being irreversible. They don't like it. They don't want things to be. They want time to be reversible, right? So according to their thinking, it looks like an error. But it's not an error. It's the weirdness that is attached to life and the world itself, and to thinking, right? Those kinds of experiences, where you have an experience of this, where this comes kind of very explicit to you. Yeah, something of the world has just shown itself to you, right? And it touches you deeply, because I think we're all hungry for what's really real.
Absolutely. Well, that right there is, if you go into the world assuming that if it is real, it is reversible, well, then you're going to carry yourself in a world that has the entire development of Hegel bracketed out from, and that's extremely consequential.
Well, pretty much the entire real world bracketed out.
Oh yeah.
All of actuality.
Well, and this is what you were saying. I claim no masterful expertise or anything, but it would seem that Heidegger is very concerned about that, is that if you bring into it certain ways of saying that this is how you hold per se, or how you witness the world, which is actually a form of possession. You don't let being unveil itself to you, in fact, possess it. Well, then guess what? You keep being from ever unveiling itself to you in a manner that would suggest you're doing it wrong, precisely because how you carry yourself in the world. And so, but this is, for me, I guess this was another reason why philosophy suddenly became so important, even though there's something terrifying, that language of realizing there's an infinity in every grain of sand. I mean, if you take it seriously, that when you go on a beach, there's an infinity in every grain of sand, you'd be paralyzed. And yet, if you don't do that, here's the thing. The example we just gave is one that if you're making that mistake of not letting, say, being disclose itself to you, well, then you can't even know that you're making that mistake. Right? Like you're totally kind of, to use another theological concept, there's a kind of total depravity, which is you are cut off from even the ability to know you are depraved. And Kierkegaard would talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big wake-up call, because because it would seem to me that one of the reasons it can be important to think about thinking, to enter into philosophy, is precisely so that you don't end up in situations where, say, you are contributing to turning the world into standing reserve, if we use Heidegger's language, or you're letting technology do your thinking for you. Well, then if technology is doing your thinking for you, then technology is not going to let you think that it's doing your thinking for you. And there's no way to escape that unless you start thinking about the thinking itself, of which is captured in this kind of self-reference. But that means there's a trade-off here, because in order to escape those kind of total depravity situations, you have to face the infinity, if we use that language, that philosophy opens up to you, which can be terrifying. But if you don't do it, well, then you're potentially at risk of ending up in these situations that you're kind of imprisoned in.
So, I have different responses to that. So on the one hand, okay, if you don't know what it is you're missing, what's the danger? You don't know, right?
Right.
So practically, okay, So what, right? You can't really speak from outside
Right.
of that vantage point because you're just not outside of it by definition. But we are now discussing these things, and so we are, trying to make headway into this what it is thinking is, these big questions and so on. And so something has ticked us and sparked us and tingled us, and and we've seen horizons, and they've puzzled us, and so we're on this this quest, right, so to speak. What's interesting for me is, well, okay, you talk about not turning being into this possessive thing, but at some point being has turned itself into this possessive thing. And why did it do that? Because with thinking with Hegel, it can't just be like a scaffolding, right? It seems like a necessary thing. And so the way Hegel thinks about these things in his philosophy is like the unconceptual forms, the abstractions, the lower forms, the immediate forms, right? They all play a part in the unfolding of the true thing, the real thing, right? So it's not that the ultimately real thing, the absolute, is just going to do away with the other stuff. No, it's going to take them on board and show how they fit in to this whole thing, such that, all these things that have been with you that look like they were not doing any work for philosophy, actually were important steps to getting you to the truth. So once we get, out of the cave, how do we get back down there? Right? So it's like, how does the truth thing turn itself in such a way as to be able to be revealed from within the untruth? Right, that's the really hard philosophical task, which in technical terms we can call making explicit the implicit explicit dynamic.
No, I think that's such a helpful language, and I've used that a lot now because I think that is so helpful. First, what you were saying about this interesting thing where if you don't know, you don't know. It reminds me, I can't remember which one it is. It's one of Woody Allen's films where there's some guy and he's having like an existential crisis in New York, and he's going down the street and he's like aggravated, and he sees this happy couple across the road, and he goes over and he's like, how can you be so happy? God is dead, everything's falling apart. Like, what's going on? And they look at him and say, oh, because we're shallow and superficial. And they keep walking. And it's like this kind of idea where I think people wonder that. They're like, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? Would it have been better if the sailor would have stayed unseen, for example, right? Would it have been better if one never saw, right? I also think this is actually a tension. It would be another subject that Kafka likes to explore quite a bit. Like, is it better to be the panther in The Hunger Artist or the hunger artist, like the animal that doesn't know? And he's like at the end of the trial. There's a very interesting role of animals in Kafka, where there's a kind of notion that, oh, we could have escaped the trial if only we were a dog. Oh, we could have escaped the situation of the hunger artist if only we were a panther, and have a kind of thoughtlessness, right? That you're kind of free of the burden of mind. And maybe that's how we avoid capture, because it does seem to be, if I use that language of capture, which is an allusion to Deleuze and all that, there is a notion that once you have a mind, then you are susceptible to certain forms of capture, which Kafka explores, and which, if people's ideologies are structured in a certain way, that they can fall into. But then that would mean that avoiding that capture or whatever would require you'd have to sacrifice the shallowness to not fall into that. And I go back and forth because it also seems like, if I understand, I always like to talk about Hannah Arendt and her banality of evil, which for the banality of evil, it is not so much that evil is banal and boring. It's where evil emerges out of a certain thoughtlessness, not stupidity, but a certain lack of reflection that results in people just following whatever the top-down structure is, and then they participate in a regime. So it's almost like, often, I think you're right, where not engaging in the self-reflexivity can be fine, but then it's almost like if a historic movement occurs, like a totalitarian regime or certain things, then it becomes very consequential. But then on the same time, people can use, the other danger though is if you do philosophy, you can become really good at rationalizing precisely because you're good at thinking, and then you can rationalize banalities of evil. But then there would be a question of, is one really engaging in philosophy at that point? Blah, blah, blah. But that's always kind of a danger, right? That one gains those abilities. The thing I wanted to ask that I wonder about when we're talking about this development in Hegel versus, say, a scaffolding, which I really like that language. One of the ways I think about it, and please correct me or anything you think about that. Like, since we have a garden, like when I go out and look at a plant. So, for example, I mentioned this before we started recording. A deer decided to eat all of our green peppers. They're dead. Now, the plant's still there. The stalk's there. All the leaves are gone, but the stalk is not there. There is no way now to make a plan, for example, to take this green pepper plant and make it grow into something else. But what you can do is reflect on what you did, what you could have done differently. And then next time you plant a green pepper, you might be able to do it better because you won't forget to, say, put down the soap, or, what you do. We take the Irish Spring and you put it in your garden. The deer don't like the smell, so they go away. So there's this idea that if you literally said, no, we're going to save this green pepper plant, and you go out and you're like, I don't know what you're doing. You're like taking tape and you're putting on leaves, or you're trying to, it's not going to work. And in fact, you may neglect the rest of the garden, and the rest of the garden dies because you're so focused on saving this green pepper plant, right? But then our tomatoes have done very well. So you go and you look at the tomatoes and say, hey, the way we did the fence this year, that's great. So you reference that and you do it again next year. For me, there's something about metaphorically. Now, I know metaphors are always dangerous precisely because you can kind of force the thought to fit the metaphor, and I don't want to do that. But when I think about philosophical development as a kind of garden, as opposed to a plan, where you literally can't say, change the result of now. Like, the flower is dead, or you water it's either alive or not. Like, there's only so much you can do to change the garden right now. Right. But there is something you can do based on what happened here on the next garden, or there might be other areas of the garden that haven't died yet, or the deer haven't gotten to, that now you can adjust your strategy on and say, oh, well, I better not forget to do the soap because I lost the green peppers. And to me, thinking about development, and I'll ask what you think of this, that to me gets closer, at least, at kind of when we talk about this kind of idea of how philosophy helps you, as opposed to it being a plan or scaffolding. It's like kind of engineering a garden, which there's a part of you that you have something to do with it, but then there's a part of you that it's out of your control. And you have, and actually knowing what is in your control and what is not in your control is a very necessary part of doing the garden well. Like, if you literally think that things are in your control that are not, you will kill everything there. That kind of, I think about that.
That's great advice generally for life, right? You don't want to obsess about the things you can't control because it's fruitless, but focus your efforts and energy on the things you can control. Let leave the rest to itself. Interesting metaphor. So I'm thinking, on the one hand, you can read up on what other people have done in their gardens in your area or similar areas, and this is the wonderful thing about concepts or inhabiting the human-minded world, is that we don't have to make the mistakes ourselves. We can just watch other people do it and learn from that, right? That is a fantastic, ability we have as, as a species, as people, which I don't think we underutilize chronically, right?
Absolutely.
We have a thing to do our own mistakes, but nonetheless, we are doing it ourselves. And nobody is going to step into our own shoes and do the thinking for us or do the garden for us. In your case, in the particular location you're at, with the animals and problems and whatnot that are in your vicinity. So it will be a mix, I think, between learning from out there what other people have done and so on, and then doing some of your own trial and error and connected with that. Which I think is largely how we go about life. Although mostly we probably try to do our own mistakes. Right. Because with the garden metaphor, what I see there is that we all have our own history. our own development, right? That nobody else has had exactly like we had, and we have our own characteristics and so on and so forth, which I listened to a business professor recently called, recently passed away, I think, Clayton Christensen. And he talks about, yeah, I am, this old, this is my age, these are my characteristics. Now, are you going to causally, infer from that I'm going to go buy a milkshake? No. So why do people buy milkshakes and so on and so forth? So we are looking at particular things, properties of people, trying to infer, yes, this is going to causally affect this and that. But it's more like association or cooperation. But all that's to say that you are inhabiting your own life, that generates your own development in history. And there is necessarily going to be some trial and error, like it is with your garden. You don't know what kind of animals are going to come by, or when some other event happens in your life that prevents you from fixing the thing you were supposed to do to the plants to prevent the other thing from happening, right? And this, I think, is an element that is absolutely key for Hegel, is that development isn't just something that happens out there in the abstract, in the hypothetical realm. Although philosophy is interested in the Sache selbst, like the content, the objective content, something that concerns all of us, as Frege would put it, nonetheless, it has something that is thought by at least one of us, right? Somebody's working at it, conceptualizing it, discovering it, expressing it. So ultimately, the story about the whole has to be one such that, well, how is the whole told from one of its parts? And then, that has to be reflected back then to the part, and so on and so forth. That, again, is the level of making the implicit, explicit dynamic.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Something.
No, it's all came out of your garden.
Well,
story, right?
The way that you're bringing
it grew out of your garden.
There you go. There you go. Well, another reason why I like the idea of a plant is because, there is not, say, a scaffolding that the plant is growing onto to be the plant structure is with the growth, right? Yeah. And what's wild is, once you're an adult and you know that a plant comes out of a seed, it's kind of banal. But when you, for example, Grace is it was really funny because the first time she had a seed, she looked at it and she when I told her, oh, the zinnias will come out of that, she looked at me like I was an idiot. So he's this is not a zinnia. Look at this. It's it's a little object. And what's so funny is the radical change that a flower or a plant undergoes, you really do kind of forget how radical it is because you get so used to the fact that a seed turns into a flower. And a freaking tomato bush, once they get really big, looks nothing like the seed. And also what you need to do to keep it alive is very different from what you need to do with the seed. There's almost a way in which Hegel does is actually understand that the development of the subject or the movement of the implicit to the explicit has that level of radicalness of change that occurs in the stages that look like they're not like anything before, but then he's showing you no, they do develop from one to the other. And for us, since we're surrounded, though, I think, by buildings, which give us a kind of metaphoric way to think of construction as being like if you look at the foundation of a building, you go, okay, I can see how that can turn into a house, right? Because the foundation of a house looks somewhat similar to what a house is going to end up on. But a seed, you actually project onto the object of a seed the knowledge that it's going to turn into a bush. You would not, if you really are like a child and you don't really get that, it's totally befuddling. Whereas my children, when they see the foundation of the house, are like, oh, that's going to be a house. It's just, there's no strangeness to this. Whereas the notion of a seed becoming a plant, that doesn't make any sense. It's it doesn't look like one at all. No. And it's really doesn't. And there's a way, to me, what's interesting is where Hegel is locating a kind of development that has that level of radicalness to it. that one, since we're so used to metaphoric of development having like where you can see in the end the top, whereas really what Hegel says, it's only from the top that you can see it was always there, right? Like once the seed becomes the tomato bush, then you go, oh, the tomato bush was always in the seed. I get it. But if you're starting at the seed, you're like, no, there's a seed here. There's no plant in it. So, but it's very difficult, I think, for moderns to think that way, just because of the kind of structures we're surrounded by.
Well, I think this illustrates really nicely certain ways of approaching things in reality, right? So your children were like, nah, you're pulling my leg. This thing can't be that.
Yes.
Look how different they are, right? And so there's a weirdness to things in nature that, given time and space, at one moment it looks like that, another moment it looks like that, right? But we, you and me, adults, what or not, we are like fully comfortable and familiar with, this becomes that because we've seen it, we've experienced it, or we know theoretically from others that this is the way it goes. And yet the really strange thing is, how on earth do we put these very different things, shapes, together and see them as one, right? Because really they're different, because they don't exist at the same time in nature and spatio-temporally. At one point it's this thing, another point is that. But conceptually, when we understand one is the other, we are evoking them at the same time. We, in the concept, in our understanding of it. So this is something that Hegel is sensitive to and unpacks in his thinking, is that, well, it's a weird way that the concept is kind of synchronous with its developments. So it's fully grown and yet not fully grown, because it's always reflected in its moments, which as moments turn out to be particulars. And yet the only reason they make sense as particulars is because they're part of some comprehensive whole, a universal, right? So once you think of the conceptual dynamics that have to be presupposed in us to even understand something to develop that has this radical shape of seed to this plant, that again brings the matter to a whole different level and really is confusing and exciting at the same time. That's what we do, how we do it in philosophy. And this is not anything that we need to like imagine a thought experiment. We're just talking about something we're very familiar with.
Exactly.
And it can evoke this strangeness and mystery that just unravels before us.
Well, it's almost like, if we're looking at Hegel, because there's a few things I wanted to say. It's almost like we, boom, like our created universe, almost like Big Bang and whole, boom, there it is, bam, the one and only.
Well, you said looking at Hegel, and I thought you meant literally. I'll keep going.
Oh, look at that guy. Hey, dude, he doesn't blink. I'll lose the staring contest. I don't know
if you look at Hegel, he looks back at you.
He looks back at you. Yeah, Nietzsche put a bis. He misspelled Hegel. It's like, shoot, I messed up. There's a way in which it's like you come and the garden's already there. Okay, it's like, you're boom, you're in, because you're like Hegel says, like you're always already in the absolute knowing, right? You're already in religion, society, it's there. So you're there. And then you're like, okay, wait a minute. If there's a garden here, how did it get here? There had to have been some, and then you're examining how it would have gotten here. What's so strange about that, it's as if instead of, say, starting with seeds, when it comes to kind of how humans operate or civilization, it's like you're starting in a plant with the plant there, and you've never seen a seed, or you've never taken the time to examine a seed, in the same way that you've never examined the way that you centrally operate, how you perceive the world, how you taste things. It's like you're already tasting and you're already in a social order and you already recognize other self-consciousness and different things. And then one day it's like, well, wait a minute, if you're already doing this, then there must have been some conditions met to make it possible for you to already be doing this. And you go, yeah, that makes sense. Well, would you like to come read the Phenomenology of Spirit and see what those are? And you're like, no. But you're like, no, because it's like that's what's happening. It's like one of the reasons I think it's mystifying what Hegel's doing is it would be like trying to go from the plant to the seed when you don't know what a seed is, or you've never thought about a seed, or even the very concept of the growth is in of itself new to you. But then the thing is that's funny about it is once somebody says to you, well, you know it had to grow, right? You go, well, yeah, I guess it would have. Like what he's saying has to have followed, but since you haven't gone from the seed up, it's mystified. But they have to be. It's like, okay, well, come with me. I know you're in society, and others say, come on, let's go look. Hey, did you ever notice that you can like feel things? Yeah, I guess so. And it's like, did you ever notice that you have these certain conscious experiences? Yeah, I guess so. And then you start growing and building, and then it gets you. It's like he takes you on a journey, like we said, a journey with the slash through it, a journey to where you already are. It's like you find yourself at the garden, and you go to a journey to understand it could be there, and then you return standing in the garden. It's like, and now you know how the garden's here.
That is a really great metaphor, because thinking about the seed and the plant upside down really goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier about asking consciousness to walk upside down.
Yes.
However, this is, I think, what Hegel tries to show us is that we think of there being some seed with regards to self-consciousness or society and whatnot. And yes, historically, empirically, things develop from more primitive elements into more and more complex ones. But for Hegel, logically and philosophically, thinking in terms of what's logically primitive and prior to something else is an advance.
Right.
And so in a weird way, we have the living plant before us, and now we're going to imagine or like generate its seed.
Yeah.
Right? Because and that means that seed was never there to begin with before we started doing this activity. So when Hegel, thinks pure being and from the logic, he's not thinking of it in terms of somewhere back in time there must have been pure being that empirically gave rise to our situation now. This is something that is created as an advance by thought itself in its capacity to then do, in philosophical terms, to think purely, right? And so it's not that the pure being was somehow out there and beyond. No, it's the event is here that we can think pure being now, right? That's the innovation, right? That Hegel sees is starting with Parmenides. He's the one who kind of fixates on pure being and conceptualizes it. Then you have Heraclitus with becoming, and then you have the others and so on. And they all like pick at the conceptions, but these are all achievements of human thought. And they're not trying to look at something that was somehow far away. So, yeah, I think, so this is how Hegel thinks about things in terms of logical order, right? And what makes sense in terms of certain presuppositionalist constraints. That itself presupposes a empirical development, historian, and so on and so on. But it's not that it is a looking into history or into reality to figure out what followed what in reality. Does that make sense? See what I'm
Absolutely.
trying to get at?
That was beautifully put. For me, this starts to hint at why it seems as, some people think that Hegel is like an idealist, right? Where like the only reality is thought, and then other people are like, no. But it seems what's so interesting to me, because obviously Hegel is extremely concrete. That's what's always very, very important. But it's like
concrete is what's grown together.
Yes, exactly. And so there's this way in which, okay, so you come into being and there's the garden, right? There is no possibility of going to a world where there's seeds and you can watch the development. It is here. But from a close analysis of the existence of the garden, which is possible because of abstraction, if you could not think abstractly, all you could do is say plant is plant. and that would be that, right? You couldn't do much. But because it's possible for humans to abstract, we can go, how is that plant there? You know, what are the conditions that make that plant there? And what must come together to make it there? So in that, it is possible to then abstract a seed. But you don't say encounter the seed not in the form of a plant, because now it is a plant. It is there. But in the concretion of the plant, it is possible then to abstract the notion of the seed that then constitutes a kind of advancement, because now you see that the concrete reality of the garden is possible because of this, is here because of the possibility of the abstraction of a seed that you cannot access directly. And that is a kind of advancement, because now you understand this concretion this concrete reality in a new way, thanks to arriving at the necessity of something of which to you must be an abstraction, because you can never get to the seed before it has become a plant. And so what's so interesting about that is then abstraction, in being able to abstract, that creates the possibility of a kind of advancement. You're not abstracting to then reconstruct the sequence, or you're not abstracting by which to determine like, oh, the reality of the plant is that sequence, because there can be kind of a reductionist move. It's like, no, in the concretion of that plant, there must be what was a seed so that it is here. And you're able to arrive at that because of the capacity of abstraction, of which would then suggest that without abstraction, you could never make that advancement into seeing the necessity of a seed. And so likewise, you can never, like right now, I can never say get back to human beings that operated before, say, society, or that operated in terms of, say, pure consciousness. But because of the way that society works, it must have been the case, given that I also have certain sensual experiences, I have certain ways of taking on the world, there must have been some process, some development to get to this. Now the error becomes is that if you this is what's interesting to me, and I really like this question, because there can be a temptation where you say, oh, we've discovered a sequence that gives rise to the garden. Now we can replicate the sequence. Now we can create more gardens because we know the sequence. And that seems like it can be dangerous, because then you think that you have a certain power, as opposed to you acknowledging the development of what made possible this concretion, so that you can then hold it or observe it or be with it in the right way. And there's an interesting something I'll have to write out. There's almost like a difference there between development and sequence, maybe like a different thought. I'll have to think on that. But the main idea is like, it suggests why abstraction, the ability to abstract, is so necessary for advancement. Because you could never, you're never going to have a world where you can watch the seed grow into the plant, basically, if we're using this metaphor. That's gone. You're already in society, right? So you cannot do that. Right. So if you're bound to only empirical thinking, well, then you can't make that you cannot make that advancement. You cannot do that. So you have to operate according to abstraction, which will then make it possible to understand that development.
Just to clarify, the way you just described this is that it's like abstraction provides the condition for the possibility of understanding development, any kind of development.
Yes.
And therefore it's presupposed when we also understand something to have a empirical development, such as seed and plant.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And I'm thinking, so what Hegel is interested in, following Kant, is unpack that logical development that may be presupposed in empirical development, but Hegel and Kant and the bunch, they don't really care about the empirical development as an empirical development. They do care about the empirical reality and actuality around them, but not in terms of a actual timely historical sequence, right?
Right.
They are interested in separating elements out in logical moments and then see, well, how does it all fit together? How does it hang together? And that is their process of making it explicit. Right? It's a logical explication. And so, to take an example, right? There's no way in reality you'll ever encounter pure being. It is an achievement of thinking. Right? So that itself requires history and development, conditions, and a lot of other philosophers stumbling around to trying to think the same thing. And but within the thinking philosophically, it's not making sense according to time and space.
Right.
It's I don't know how much. So it's a kind of logical progression. We try to make sense of the sense making without imputing how we go about in our daily lives making sense of things, because we are going around encountering various different shapes of plants and animals, and then we put together, oh yes, this little thing, seed, that full plant, yes, that's really the same thing, which presupposes the concept, but the concept itself is not something that goes down the same way and is itself temporal. At least Hegel thinks that way, right? And what he wants to do is unpack this. And the really crazy thing is that, well, in the atemporal thinking about these concepts and categories and forms, right, there seems to be development.
Right.
You think pure being, wham, you're into nothing. Hang on, there's just a change that happened there.
That's right.
It's becoming, right? And off it goes, right? Usually we think of logic as this rock solid thing that, A equals A, principle non-contradiction. They're just forms out there set in stone. And Hegel sort of radicalizes that through shining a light on it and making it explicit. Just making it explicit in a strange way changes it. So it's like quantum mechanics before 100 years before it.
I think you're putting that very well. So on what you're saying, if we have that picture from Nabokov, which is this picture, and then you finally see the sailor. It's made of small pictures, and then you see the big picture that's there. That's more of a development than a sequence. There was no sequence that necessarily gone through where you see it, right? Like, that's why people, when you have one of those pictures, they'll walk over here, then they'll walk over there. Like, nobody knows the sequence, and it doesn't even seem to be a set sequence that you do, and then boom, you see the image. It's just suddenly, for some very mysterious reason, you catch it. One person, it's because they looked at the paint in the right corner. Other people, they saw the paint in the top corner. Other people, it's because who knows why, and then they see it. And now it's like you can never unsee it. But it seems like there's a development, but not a sequence. Or let's put it this way. If there is a sequence, it is so personalized, so particular, and so difficult to trace that it's almost illogical to talk about a sequence there. It just kind of happens. There's a development that happens in the person looking at the picture, that then once it happens, it's happened, and it never goes back. And there it is. Whereas with a sequence, I know that if I take this Lego block and I take this Lego block and I put them on top of each other, I build and I create a Lego tower. There's a sequence. That sequence is not the same as what it seems to be what Hegel is saying that concepts operate according to.
So just a quick question. When you say sequence, do you mean a temporal sequence or?
Temporal.
Do you mean like at T1, this happened, at T2, that happened,
yes,
and at T3,
yes,
whatever,
yes,
right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So more empirical, more just kind of basic. I'm taking more kind of a basic sort of just building point to point. So, like it would seem with like sequence, there's only one way, for example, to get the Lego tower that looks this way. If you have a certain Lego tower, there's a certain sequence. Maybe there's some variation, but generally there's a very bound sequence that has to be followed to get that tower, and it can be replicated quite easily, right? But with development, say seeing the picture, seeing the sailor that you couldn't unsee, I don't know, you just look at it and then it hits you eventually. Like when you ask people, well, how do you see it? They're like, you just look at it, you kind of see it. It's very difficult to sort of give people the map, I guess you could say, of the sequence that they need to undergo to make it happen. It's just there. And so like with the concept, what's so interesting is it's like, how does the concept arrive at where it is, where it comes up with the notion of pure being, or it comes up with where you're at? What is the sequence that occurred to make, say, philosophy develop the way that philosophy happened? It just happened. It's very hard. But if you ask
Luxury.
luxury, yeah, that's what it leisure
Yeah,
or whatever.
we had
But
to
if you
have
ask
free time.
people like, well, what was the history of the city or the history of the computer? Oh, well, this guy invented that and this guy did this and it sort of built and they kind of followed. And yeah, they had eureka moments, but it's much more easier to sort of follow a sort of sequence of how the invention built up the way that it did. Where when you look at like philosophy, there's a lot of inspiration, there's a lot of kind of mystery, there's a kind of like, well, Dostoevsky had this and then he came up with this novel. It's so interesting where when you follow, say, the how philosophy develops or how the arts develop, it feels much more developmental in the sense of boom, they just had the picture. Whereas when you have things like in the sciences or whatever, it can feel much more sequential. And I think when you exist, say, in the modern world, it's so easy to think of everything being kind of sequential, where then that sequence gets read into Hegel. Whereas in Hegel, it's more of this kind of developmental that's being followed. But then, of course, it is if this present moment indeed developed as it did, well, then what were the conditions that made that development possible? And then you have to posit off of the fact that development has given a rise to now, and then you posit what were the conditions that make now thus the case. And I guess that's what I was trying to say with the plant, where you go, okay, I just, boom, the concept of the full tomato plant is there. It's there. I see it now. Okay, well, let me posit then what must have made that occur, of which here's the thing, until I developed into the moment of seeing the full tomato plant, then I couldn't have even asked that question. Like until another way to put that, and then I'll pass it back to you. Until you see the full picture of the sailor, you wouldn't even ask the question of how do they paint the picture to do that? How is it possible to make a painting that can do that? Like, what is the conditions that have to be met to make that picture there? The picture doesn't change. It's still the same picture that it was, but now you're asking very different questions. Why was it that standing here made me see the full picture as opposed to being up close? How is it that the artist that, like, you enter an entire new, dare I say, horizon of questions you will ask about that painting now that you've developed to the place where you see the whole.
Yeah, so Hegel's not going to deny that we can do a history of ideas. We can do a history of philosophy.
Sure.
He does that himself, lectures on the history of philosophy, right? Where he gives his shtick on what he thought Plato was doing, Aristotle was doing, Spinoza, Marmont, and so on and so forth, right? All these thinkers. So there is an empirical, temporal, sequence, we might say, that of these things. But that doesn't tell you anything about the why.
Yes.
Right? Why did Aquinas think about so-and-so? And why did Hegel think about so-and-so? Why did Kant think about so-and-so? And I think it's interesting to focus in on the notion of conditions, because I think it's implied in the way you said it that, well, the conditions don't determine the outcome. The conditions. And more importantly, for something to be conditions for something else, it's really the conditioned thing that is deciding what becomes the conditions. So there is a reflected sort of sense with regards to relationship between conditions and conditions. And Hegel outlines this in his logic because it's part of his doctrine of essence, that the conditioned is what's running the show, because that is positing what is conditions for something else. And in historical terms, Hegel sees this generally in terms of, like geniuses or great historical people. The conditions are all around them, but they just see what they can do with it, right? So in a way, conceptually, they have seen the picture, to use your analogy, right? And then they make use of that,
Yes.
right? So, so Hegel talks about Napoleon and Caesar. There were certain, historical circumstances which they didn't produce, right? But they exploited those and knew how to use them and manipulate them. And anyone could have done that, right? So technically, logically, like anyone doesn't need to be Napoleon or Caesar. It could have been Sulla or anyone else, a historical person, or it could have been Napoleon's brother who was the one to do these things. But it wasn't. So something in biographically in history happened to these individuals such that they saw intuitively the rationality that was coming alive around them, right? And in which they took part. This is how Hegel sort of cashes it out, what developments in history, how they occur. But I think the same can be said for scientists and artists. And, you mentioned Dostoevsky, right? He lived in a certain place, certain time. Could have been somebody else who wrote those things, right? It's not impossible, or it could be some slight variations, but novels were being written by other people, and somebody else could have, written similar kind of novels, but it wasn't. It was Dostoevsky, because he saw a certain rationality that was around him, and he tapped into that, he captured it, and that, for Hegel, seems to be defining historical development. And then the outcome of what they do, right, usually is beyond their control, right, because it's so many moving elements and complexity. But then that becomes a condition for somebody else to then see another rationality, a new world that is opening up and developing, and in them capturing that, yet another world goes on and opens up, right? So we can use sequential terms to give a list, to cash things out, but this only gives us a kind of superficial view of it, right? Which presupposes what actually happened. But what actually happened was motivated by a why.
That was really good when you brought in the why. So it's almost like you have, if I were to use the three term, like sequence, condition, and development. There's almost a way what ends up happening is in mechanical thinking, sequence is the condition. So for example, if you want to build a house, then you have this, you have the sequence of building the foundation, building the floors, and that is the conditions that need to be met. Like the sequence kind of is the conditions. And once it's done, you say, oh, we built a house. The development is finished, right? It is kind of done. So in mechanical...
So you mean like it has to come in steps, right? It cannot you can't just make house boom there.
Right, that's right. It has to be built. Yeah. So it's almost like a mechanical, like if I'm just using that term, like more mechanical thinking or doing, where sequence, the line between sequence, condition, and development, they're all blurred. They're all together. Whereas with the concept, there's a certain sequence. If there was no sequence, there couldn't be any development, because there couldn't be any possibility of conditions being met that occur to the development of then seeing the picture. But it is not necessarily the case that the sequence that makes that the sequence, a sequence occurs that mysteriously almost arrives. When I say mysteriously, it's too complex to sort of put in a blueprint. But a sequence occurs that then results in there being conditions where now a development is possible, but only if people do a certain thing. Like it's conditional. The development is still conditional, but there had to be a sequence that occurred in history, so those conditions were there, where if a Napoleon met the condition, boom, now there's a different development in the historic spirit. Like now there's a transformation in how society occurs. And then, of course, once that development happens, it seems like it had to have happened. It seemed like it was just a sequence where sequence, development, and condition are all blurred together. But actually, it was not. It only seems that way after it occurs. It's, history always retrospectively has a kind of mechanical air to it. But actually, it is not the case. And I guess another way, if we go back to the garden example, you can, like, the sequence to make a garden is tilling, planting, watering. There's a very kind of general sequence that you follow. But guess what? If you carry that sequence out where there's a lot of red clay, that sequence will not give way to the development of a garden because the clay is bad. Or if you carry out that sequence, say, in the winter when it's really cold, then there will not be any development of plants because they're all going to be dead because it's too freaking cold. Yeah. Not only do you have to carry out the sequence, you have to carry out the sequence in the right conditions, of which may have the development, but not guaranteed, of course, because you could carry out the sequence in the spring under the right conditions where there's a lot of fertilizer, not a lot of red clay, but then it doesn't rain, so the development doesn't occur, right? So there are three conditions that have to be met, and the last one of the development is kind of the mysterious one, where then, okay, you carried out the sequence under the right conditions. Now let's see if the plants grow. Now let's see if the development happens. But there's no guarantee, because the conditions could change. It may be too hot that year. You may have bought bad seeds or different things like that. Whereas when you build a barn, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, you can't have it like on the side of a hill, but the conditions are much, much more general, much more simple. The conditions are simple. The sequence is pretty similar. You do the sequence is pretty similar, and you know what the finished product is going to be. You have the blueprint, you know what's going to occur. So in kind of mechanical thinking, sequence, condition, and development are let's just say they're much closer together. I don't know if I want to say they're exactly the same, but they're very linked. Whereas when it comes to the development of the concept, if you will, there's this sequence that has to occur. Then there are certain conditions that have to be there. And then the development that emerges out of those conditions has to occur as well. But then the question is, why does it occur? So another way to put it is like, sequence doesn't necessarily entail development, but development has to have sequence to have the possibility of the development, but cannot be reduced to the sequence. And so then the question, of course, is, why does the development happen? How did it happen? What's going on? Well, now you're right. Now thinking is thinking about thinking, and to me then, and then I'll give it back to you, the very realization that in the formulation of the concept, there's a difference between sequence, condition, and development is a kind of advancement I would take in Hegel. Not that I'm saying we're making an advancement here in the history of the concept. It'd be nice if we did. Pretty good afternoon. But that in of itself has a kind of advancement, because once you go, oh, wait, the emergence of the concept is not the same as the building of a building. Oh, wait, now the concept knows itself in a different way that may make it, as it goes forward, thus capable of creating new conditions for different development in different ways. But it will not do that until it sees itself as developing different from the construction of a building. In the same way that once you see the big picture out of the small pictures, now you see it and now you can act in a different way. Likewise, once concept sees its development as different than the construction of a building, then it has a new horizon of questions about itself, ways that it carries itself, and now it can, it can do things differently. But it would never do that unless it thinks about thinking. And that would, of course, require all of the not being, facing all of the anxiety and existentialism that comes from that. But that's where, Hegel talks about the stages of the cross, right? And different things like that.
Indeed. Well, a house doesn't build itself.
Right.
Plants do. They grow themselves, right? So there is a way in which the stuff that makes up a house is externally manipulated, right? And done in a way where what's going to happen when you put this brick on top of the other. You keep on doing it enough, you'll have a wall, right? So there is a kind of positing of cause and effect and you want that to be very constrained. You want to minimize that. So like when you're building computer chips, you don't want any randomness there in your calculations, right? You want that to, when it's supposed to, something's supposed to happen, 0, that's going to follow with, something else. Exactly, right? And so this seems to me to be the mark of technology. Technological thinking is figuring out how something works and, minimize the way in which you can eliminate randomness and probabilities with regards to that, or at least control the probabilities to a degree you can live with. But you can't do the same kind of way of thinking with regards to living beings or self-conscious beings, even more so, right? Like the Clayton Christensen examples, like, I have all these characteristics. None of those going to tell you whether I'm going to go buy a coffee at Starbucks or what have you.
Right.
So it's very easy in history, as something has happened, to then, this made sense with regards to that. But that is, how a certain life form developed in that situation, and the same might not be true, in the circumstances now, because we're dealing with living things, which in Hegel's view are self-determining. In other words, free.
Right.
And it's the free being that sets out the conditions for stuff to happen. We think of the conditions have to be prior to the conditioned. Hegel turns it around, so that no. Logically, it's the other way around. The conditioned thing sets out the conditions. So for something to be, counted as food for a plant or whatever, it's got to be a plant. Or something becomes attractive for human beings. It's got to be human beings pursuing various different projects and so on. So I agree with you. There still has to be a stepwise development with regards to these living beings and our own thinking and our own experiences. But here, I think philosophy might come up against some inherent limits. So when we're giving an account of consciousness in Hegel's case, or the concept in the science of logic, we can't start with the fully fledged concepts because we have constraints of presuppositionlessness and being self-critical, which means we don't want to take anything for granted. Well, if we drive that up to 11 to its utmost extreme, what are we left with? We can't take, we have to go into anything determinate becomes something taken for granted. And so there is a kind of radical beginning there, right? In which, yes, once we have got the development going and we look back, we can see, well, yes, pure being, nothing becoming, these are conditions for us to understand then the fully explicit concept. And so that makes sense that these were immediate medices of the concept, but not the concept as it was then later explicated. But that's making sense within the development.
Right.
Oh, I mean, the systematic laying out of the philosophy, right? Which is not the same as somebody actually thinking here and now concretely, because there you can jump, you can make mistakes in thinking. In Hegel's account of logical order, there are no mistakes as a kind of scaffolding mistakes, kind of in that sense. But when you have an idea, when you see the picture, there isn't any steps there. Right. It just opens up to you.
Right.
It's like Athena coming out of Zeus's head, right? She comes fully armored, ready to go. Right? There's it's not a baby coming out first. It's a grown armored woman ready to do battle, right? That's wisdom. Right. Wisdom doesn't come half-baked. It's either done or you gotta put it together and prepare it. But there isn't any real in between. And I think Hegel emulates that in the systematic development. But the systematic development is constrained by, you can't skip steps. It's purely conceptual.
I really like that Athena example. So this is what gets you were right on where you noted that a plant has something about itself that grows, whereas a building doesn't build itself, right? So this is what is extremely interesting. In order for there to be seemingly a division between sequence, condition, and development, there has to be something about the thing being considered that has a preset condition about it that makes that very split between those stages possible. Whereas with a building, when we're saying like technological thinking, the condition of sequence, condition, and development all being together, it's the condition of the thing not being alive, right? Just to be very generally, right? It's not alive, therefore those three go together. But in order to separate them, like I think we can do more so with a plant, there's a condition that has to be met and predetermined, mind you, before the plant. It's not like a seed says, hey, I'm going to be a seed. It just is a seed. And so there has to be a preset condition that then makes it very possible for those three things to be split apart. But this is so interesting because then then the human, if the human or the development of the concept is a thing of which is more so a split between the three, then the concept has to be conditioned by being something that is more organic, more alive, more indeterminate than determinate. If it was determinate like a building, well, then you could put them all together. But it's not like it's not like thinking decided that it wanted to operate in the mysterious way that it does. Like I think about this all the time. Do you will what you think or do you not will what you think? It seems like a bothness, right? Sometimes it feels like you will what you think, but at other times it's really mysterious. You just have an idea and it comes to you. Where did it come from? And so the movement of thinking is this very strange bothness of will and not will. And it has to, if it didn't have that character, I guess I'm saying, if it didn't have that character, then sequent, condition, and development would all be blurred together. But because it has this character of being something you control, but something you don't control at the same time, it's able to split those three apart. But it also can choose not to split those apart. You can choose to only think non-philosophically, to get back to what we were saying at the beginning. You can choose to never think about thinking. And if you never think about thinking, then at least relative to you practically live as if sequent, condition, and development are all the same. But the moment you think about thinking, you split them apart. And that's part of the horror of it. Now you've split it apart and now you have to do the work. And so it's interesting because I wonder about it quite a bit if there's, and then I'll give it back to you. The very experience of thinking suggests that thinking itself is preconditioned, which is weird. Thinking itself is preconditioned. And it's almost because of that precondition that Hegel has to make this split between the three, sequence, development, and condition. I know he doesn't use those terms, but there's like this different understanding of how the concept arises than just mere sequence. And that becomes necessary because of how thinking itself seems somehow preconditioned. And that creates a really weird circumstance.
Yeah, so this really goes into a classical division between freedom and necessity. And Hegel's not going to deny, there are necessities in the world. But the way he thinks about the necessity and freedom is that, well, what's really free isn't something that's free at the cost of, not being, having something necessary to it. It is working in and through necessities, right? So in a way, freedom is kind of self-necessity. So you're right that there seems to be like preconditions to thought in the sense that there are certain rules, right? You want to say something determinate, something meaningful, and not just splurge out a bunch of words, right?
Right.
And there seems to be a necessity to what you're saying.
Exactly.
And Hegel's going to say, we should focus on that. We should take that on board. But that's not a limitation to us, right? It's actually an opportunity. We have to go through it and with it. And but then once we, get the sense of whatever it is we're trying to say, let's say you write a sentence and you try to give a point or a concept or an idea. Once you have the idea, it's not reducible to the things down on the sentence. It is happening in and through the sentence, but it's not reducible to the science as such, right? It's sort of taken a life of its own through that necessity, right? So the necessity was necessary, but once you got the idea, it's off doing its own thing now. And I think this is really like the mark of plants, animals, human beings thinking. It's all phenomena of things doing their own thing. And in a crude way or silly way, you might say that Hegel's philosophy is all about things doing their own thing even more. Let's have more things doing their own thing.
Yes.
And what's our sciences doing now? It's more and more splintered off, more and more fragmented, because we're getting more and more interested in tinier details of things doing their own thing.
I really like how you put that. On this idea that Hegel wants things to do more of what they are, for things to do their own thing. What's interesting?
And, I can't, foretell really what that's going to be until it gets there.
Exactly, and there's a way.
Even though there will be necessities.
Well, this is very good. There's a way. So a few things.
Breathe, Daniel.
No, that's right. Yeah, no, this is really good. If thought was not preconditioned to being somehow limited into having some degree of it being a result of almost, I want to call daydreaming, or that's a little strong, but that kind of like thoughts come that you don't choose. Like if thought was not limited from being unable to stop itself from having some part of it that wasn't fully willed, but instead was just necessary, it just appeared as it, without being willed, well, then thought would basically be robotic. Like the very separation of sequence, condition, and development requires that necessity, that thing that cannot be changed, that if you could change it, well, then you would be a computer. And all of this tendency today to think of all of life as being computers or programming, and thus standing reserved and technological, like if you actually did not have to acknowledge any limit at all, then you would be like a blank slate and ergo a computer. You would be able to program it. And therefore, there would not be any meaningful distinction between sequence, condition, and development for the human. Mm-hmm. The very fact that there is a meaningful distinction between those things that arises through history is thanks to a limitation. It is thanks to a certain precondition. And thus that precondition frees us from the temptation of reducing ourselves to robots. Because we can't do it. Because here's the thing, if we were capable of reducing ourselves to robots, why don't we? Don't you love the world? Don't you want to make sure bad stuff doesn't happen?
We certainly try.
Well, but that's the thing. We certainly try. And the thing is, if we didn't have this limit that we're describing on thinking of itself, why shouldn't we keep trying? There will always be a reason to keep trying, right? But if in fact this limit exists, and if, in fact, the concept can become aware of this limit and its impossibility of getting rid of the limit, well, then we are free of the burden of trying to turn ourselves into robot, and in fact, shouldn't try to turn ourselves into robots. In fact, it would be a good thing not to try to do it. And in fact, to instead pay more attention, not to trying to program ourselves, but to the development of the concept in terms of sequence, development, and condition, sequence, condition, and development, so that we can do that better, so we can do better what we are. And that is a being that has an element of their thinking preconditioned. And so the limitation then indeed does become empowering, because it removes from us the thought of trying to turn ourselves into robot. But of course, here's the problem. In order to realize that that limit is there, what do you have to do? Think about thinking. You have to engage in philosophy, right? You have to think about thinking. So here I think we can see where there is actually quite a cost not to engage in philosophy, even though we can go back to the Woody Allen movie with the people in New York and they're shallow and superficial. You say, oh, that's good. Well, the problem is, if you're shallow and superficial, like in the Woody Allen film, then it is not possible for you to actually realize that there is a certain limit that makes it impossible for humans to blur together sequence, condition, and development, and therefore that we shouldn't try to turn ourselves into robots. And so then there actually is a consequence to not engaging into philosophy, because you don't realize that that limit is there to stop you from trying to treat human beings like standing reserves and robots. And thus you can easily fall into it, because why shouldn't you? Because you have no reason to think there's a limit that would keep you from succeeding in that. And shouldn't you want to succeed in that? Because then you can make sure human beings don't do bad things. Then you can make sure that we make the world a better place. And so you have to make humans enter into philosophy, stand on their head. And it's on, because the act of, like you said, like it's like standing on your head. Well, it's kind of like standing on your head to think of limits as empowering. It's kind of crazy to think of necessity as freeing. It's kind of crazy to think of there being something about accepting that there's some sort of nature that you don't control, that actually is like that's great. Because if you could control it, then what would that mean you should do? Well, it means you should blur together sequence, development, and condition, and there would be no possibility of the concept developing in ways that are unforeseen and good precisely because they're unforeseen, because that gives them the artistic and the creative element. So right there, and then I'll give it back, like, you see there where the limit has a freeing element to it, because the limit makes it impossible to blur together sequence, condition, and development. And in so doing, we are then justified not to try, and therefore focus on being human and being better at being human versus try to be robots. Because if the limit wasn't there, why shouldn't we try to be robots? Because if we were all robots, we could stop bad things from happening in the world or be more efficient and so on and so forth. So in that way, there's a freedom in the limit.
Yeah, I think that's it's really well put. And I'd like to think of what you call limit in terms of like constraints, necessities, and so on and so forth, right? Things we all have to deal with. What you were talking about reminded me of the Stoic in the Phenomenology, right? Because the Stoic lives in the immediacy of freedom, the freedom of self-consciousness. And this freedom is intoxicating. In a certain way, good, because it reveals to us that really we can go anywhere with our thinking, and we can think anything. Like I can tell you a bunch of lies and so on, and you wouldn't be able to tell, right? In theory, right? Maybe there might be some tells and hints, or you might use reason to deduce this guy's full of shit, right? But then there really is something atomic and pure about thinking, that's such that we can go anywhere with it, and we might kind of get lost in it and think that, well, I can make this. Why don't I just make this my reality? That everything becomes like this fluid, programmable, nothing has any kind of stakes situation. That leads you to skepticism, which is is a weird place where, okay, well, and then everything can be up for grabs, and then therefore nothing has meaning, which then further leads you into unhappiness for Hegel, because you come up against these situations that, in being unlimited, actually become as experienced as absolute limits.
Yes.
Yeah. So take on the little limit and use it as a building stone, and don't look for a life without constraints. Work with the constraints, use them, understand them, utilize them, right? This is what Hegel thinks we're doing as self-conscious beings together in society, right? We're molding the world, using nature, using the resources in a way that benefits us and the creatures around us, that allows us to then do more philosophy and become more, let things do more their own thing. We'll of course have problems, but these become apparent because we're doing this on this project, not despite it, right? So there is I like that, how what you were thinking kind of connects up with what Hegel and the phenomenology regarding the Stoicism. Yeah.
Well, the point that you just made on seeing conditions, and I think you're right. Constraints is kind of better than limit, because limit can kind of sound like a event horizon of a black hole or something. Necessity, but there's well, again, this is where when I think about the artist metaphorically, the artist knows they need paint. They know they need a canvas. If they don't have these things of which are external to them and that are created by other people, then they're not going to be able to make their art, right? In the artistic act, there's a blend between raw, like there's something raw, individual about art, because you're doing your art and no one else in the world can make that painting. And yet the very possibility of the unfolding of that very individual expression requires an external world, requires there to be an acceptance of, I'm going to paint on this canvas, not on other canvases, a certain acceptance of what is given. Yeah. And so you see both going on there. And what I think, on what you were saying on the unlimited, I'll just add real quick, is it makes me think of like right now and actually I was just listening, Raymond does really good work on like biotech technology, Fukuyama, people like that. But you have kind of like this notion where if, if we don't develop gene editing, someone else will, China will make gene editing and then they'll get ahead. So we have to do it. But if we do it, then the rich will get it. And it's going to it's almost this feeling where we can't stop it. Like it's taking you somewhere that you don't want to go and you don't know how to avoid it. And that also makes me think of like the Gerard and the battle till the end on this notion that, we don't have a scapegoat mechanism anymore. And that creates a game theory dynamic where escalation has to eventually lead to the apocalypse and there's nothing we can do about it. All of that to me right there goes to show you how being unlimited kind of actually limits you now to being forced in a certain direction. Because both of those are like, well, now we're not bound by our genes. We can do whatever we want. Well, guess what? Now you're in a kind of ever escalating war of gene editing with other societies. And it's almost like you can't avoid it because they're going to make it and you're going to make it. There's this kind of feeling of precisely the unlimitedness of the technology is why you are now limited to make it and you cannot escape it. And now you have to almost go into a world of Galactica, that sci-fi movie, or genetic engineering. You don't want to go there, but you have no choice. And it's so funny because it's precisely these technologies. It's like once you create 5G surveillance technology, like these technologies that have a certain unlimited to it now, it's now possible. The government is no longer bound. It can watch whoever it wants. It can create networks for whoever it wants. It's almost like you have to do it. Like you have no choice now, because if you don't, someone else will use the technology against you. And so it becomes like this ever escalating, worsening game theory dynamic. And I think
good. It should watch me because, I'm spending all day reading Hegel. And so it might learn something.
You're right. There you go. That's really funny, actually. Well, and you see, so, and also, well, actually to that point, because if you can say, well, Daniel, if we were to create a massive surveillance state, we could make sure there's no crime. We could make sure that people don't do bad things. Shouldn't you support it? You can always, here's the point. You can always come up with a reason to do a thing. Sure. The only thing that will stop you is a limit. Like the very non-existence of the technology is what would keep you from, say, creating the surveillance state, right? But once you make it, you can always have a debate about it. And actually it has a trajectory of being realized just because of game theory dynamics. The more unlimited it is, the more it almost is inevitable, actually, because of just how game theory dynamics work out.
Right.
Whereas, funny enough, when you're limited, it almost creates more freedom. There's actually more liberty when you're freedom, because you're no longer like, well, I know that you can't control it. And I know you don't have a surveillance camera. I know you don't have, say, the editing technology. I don't have it either because it doesn't exist. And now we're free of wondering what we should do regarding gene editing because we know other people have it. Right. And so there's a certain freedom that being limited from the ability to engage in gene editing actually gives you, because you don't have to wonder what your neighbor's going to do with the gene editing, what you're going to do with the gene editing. So then you see right there how limits have a way of actually creating freedom.
Right. But I think it usually things like these, as you were making the case, there are some good reasons to have full surveillance.
Sure.
And there are some bad reasons because nobody has privacy anymore. Right. So really, what do we want? Do we want total security, or do we want to have, agency in our own lives and so on and so forth? So I see it not. So here is a piece of tech that elevates a certain kind of freedom and depreciates another. And I think these are just all around us. I think this is really the jobs, the eternal jobs of humanity is, okay, we want security, we want agency, have privacy and so on, right? These are things we want to get done. What kind of, technologies and devices and tools are out there to, give us these things and enable them? Well, it turns out that things like total surveillance will elevate some, but at a huge cost to another. So there's a conflict of two freedoms there. Same with gene editing, right? Some things might take away diseases and so on and so forth, but other times it might generate weaknesses, vulnerabilities in the health system and so on and so forth, right? So I don't see it as as a kind of all good or all bad.
Sure.
There are limitations coming with tech or even without the tech, because at the end of the day, there's going to be certain eternal jobs waiting for us. It needs to get done somehow, and there are going to be things that present themselves that, oh yeah, I can do this job for you in this way at this convenience. But turns out there's always this tension and negotiation, ultimately between freedoms, not between necessity and freedom. That's how I see Hegel, tell the story when it regards to his thinking about society.
No, I think that's 100%, that there is always pluses and minuses to different technologies. And certainly I'm not anti-technology in the same way that Heidegger was an anti-technology. What he was concerned about is the absorbing automatically of a technological way of thinking without realizing it. And that was the problem. This is what I would ask, though, that I guess what I'm trying to say is the very existence of the trade-offs creates a tendency where what we tend to do is try it, like some degree, or try to do it in a manner that is limited, which then once we try it, it changes how we are toward it, which then makes us try it a little more, then try it a little more, and try it a little more. And like, they have a tendency of eventually getting away from us. I don't want to say, I'm not trying to say they necessarily get away from us. I don't, that's not what I'm trying to say. But the more, let's put it this way, I guess this is what's interesting to me. The more something opens doors, ergo, we're no longer limited by our gene technology, the more that the thing has a tendency to eventually fully come into the picture. Precisely because once it arises, there is in fact good to it, not pure bad. But precisely because there's good to it, then the society, they say, well, let's try to just use it for disease, right? Let's just try to do it so let's develop it so we can use it to disease. Well, if you develop it to use it for disease, you've probably developed the same thing that can be used to select babies based on certain IQ attributes, right? And so then that gets away from, so then it gets away from you in a way. And I guess what I'm saying, there's almost about, I don't want to say it's necessary, but it's more so determined. I'm just making an example. It seems almost more so determined that the more a thing reduces limits, the more it tends to get away from you, per se, eventually. Whereas if you're just straight up can't do it, you literally are not capable of thinking without it having some preconditioning requiring an element of it that you don't control or do control, like we said earlier, well, then there's nothing that can get away from you. It just is. It's just the nature that is there that you either learn to live with and let thrive and like bring out more so, or not. And so what's so interesting, I guess, is that you do see where limited actually has ways of freeing, and unlimited, or approaching it like an acetate lime or whatever. I'm not literally saying that gene editing makes you unlimited, but it's making you less limited, we can say. That then has a more determined nature to eventually get you somewhere that you don't want to be. And we just don't think that way. We don't think in those terms of limit actually having a freeing element, and anything that removes limits as having a, because of game theory, a determinate nature to bring you somewhere that you don't necessarily want to be. And I think some of the genius of Hegel is like when he's talking about, say, the development of the state, he's like, yeah, I know, the state makes you do things you don't want to do, but look here, if you didn't have law, if you didn't have family, if you didn't have the social contract, you would actually not be in the world that you wanted to be in. You may not like these restrictions, but actually these restrictions that the state puts upon you actually has some ways to making you realize a freedom that you otherwise could not reach. So there's a way in which he's trying to, you almost see this entire kind of rebel, and then I'll give it back to this kind of teaching in Hegel of, don't assume that a limit means that you've lost something, or a constraint. I keep saying limit. Don't assume that a constraint is bad. Don't assume that acknowledging that there's something valuable about thinking that you don't control, don't think that acknowledging that is bad. In fact, actually acknowledging that is a good thing, because then you understand there's a difference between, say, sequence, condition, and development. And then because you know there's a difference between those, you can then better be yourself. Oh, and doing that, one, is only possible if you engage in philosophy. Only possible if you engage in thinking about thinking. Only possible if the concept has an awareness of itself.
Right. But like with regards to particular things, such as gene editing or surveillance and so on, in one way, we don't really know what's going to happen until we start doing it. And, there might be a lot of steps and complications and consequences we don't foresee, right? This is the thing, the murky thing about reality, dealing with concrete things is, and stuff in history is like, we don't know the full outcome of it until after a certain time has passed, right? But what we are interested in is trying to figure out, well, is this thing rational, right? Does it make sense? Does it, fit into a rational society, which what we're all trying to, collectively achieve, make the good life, maximize the good life for all of us together. So I think there is something to be said that, there might be certain constraints in a game theory deterministic way that pushes us towards this. But on the other hand, maybe that's also a good thing, because that allows the mistakes to become evident, and then we learn, and then we dump it, or we modify it in a way that then makes sense, and then we move on to whatever is next. And it's up to the people who are involved with those things to figure it out. Maybe philosophy will be helpful in clarifying things, but the rationality is going to make itself evident in actuality sooner or later. So that's, Hegel's statement with the rational is actual and actual is rational.
Right. No,
the reason is not so impotent that you need philosophers to clarify things for people. People can get the sense of what's going on, when things are heading south, when things are not really working. It's a powerful thing in the world.
Now, this to me is butting on like the edge of something that I wonder about, that is entirely speculative, and I have it's not completed as a thought. There's something about...
Well, it is completed and not completed.
There you go. It's all together. Thank you. I appreciate that. There's something about where Hegel is so wise. And what he understands, he says, okay, if we really want to say, understand how humanity has moved through history, if I just use general language, precisely because history is so murky and there are so many variables for why things go the way it does, we're not really going to get at history by, say, examining the archives of the books and going through and putting up some sort of book. Yeah, that's all good. That's all well. But that kind of research is questionable on how much it can yield. But you know what? Humans are there's something about humans who have been going through history that have a kind of consistency to them. They're always found in the middle of necessity. They have thoughts that they don't fully control. They find themselves interacting with other people. So what if we were to use the human as the kind of constant through history to figure out how history is developed from the constant of the human subject, his or herself, as opposed to looking for a sequence in history that will show us why we've arisen to the present, because that sequence is very unlikely to be accurate because of the radical murkiness of history. So what if we were to posit the development in history using the human subject as the constant? Maybe that would have a better chance of yielding something reliable. Of course, it would just be a map. Of course, it wouldn't be the territory, but the likelihood that it might actually be useful or have something, use is a questionable term, that it would be accurate, have something to do with how history actually went is higher. See, that's where I see, for me personally, as one of the great innovations kind of Hegel, is he's like, rather than do a kind of historic project based on research, which is all well and good and great, but we all know the more a historian moves from the very micro to the macro, the more likely there's mistakes, right? Because of the complexity that goes into a big world event. I know there's a big push for big history. I understand that. I am not a historian, so everything I say, take with a bag of salt. But there's a kind of notion that, if you're doing the history of, say, the codfish industry. I actually read a book on the development of the codfish industry. It was actually quite interesting. There's a higher chance that that is accurate than, say, the history of the American Civil War, or the English Civil War, right? Because that's so broad and so big and so murky. But Hegel is like, but if I myself, as a subject, experience the world in X, Y, Z way, well, then there's good reason to think that people in the past did so as well. So what if we were to posit that as something as a constant and see if we can understand how history develops according to that? That to me is quite innovative and quite interesting. But this is where then this is where gene editing in particular, or transhumanism and all of that, becomes curious. Because up until this point, you were saying how technology has an element of we have to go through it in order to see the good and the bad, right?
Well, we can't help ourselves. We're curious.
Right. We can't help. No, that's exactly. It's going to develop. Well, when the human subject is still constant in the midst of the development of that curiosity, if you will, well, then the process still has you're probably going to figure out the good from the bad, and you're going to go from there because you have some sort of constant of the necessity of the human subject by which to make that deduction. But what happens if we gain the ability to change the nature of the human subject? What happens if we gain the ability to transform how the mind thinks, how genes come about? And so the consistency of the subject through history can no longer be assumed because now it's a different subject, or you've entered into the singularity or the transhuman. That to me is where, and this is a thought I have to think on, I find it very interesting. To me, there seems to be, when we think about the nature of technology, before technologies that could change the subject in a Hegelian framework, that seems different, possibly, I don't know, than thinking about the subject when the subject is actually able to potentially change their self. Because that means there's no necessity, right? There's no necessity in the subject, or not as much necessity as much. Whereas it seems to have this ability to work out through, to work out the good and bad of technology, to have that have a thrust that's more developmental. You need the consistency of the human subject. Because if you don't have that constant, it becomes difficult to determine what's good for that subject and what's not good for that subject, right? But if you can change the subject, does the way that technology unfolds in history no longer have that working out in a way that tends to be, dare I say, more constructive than deconstructive? I don't know. I think about it a lot, and then I'll give it back to you, because you're right. We've talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes because you're so delightful, and everyone should take your class, and I'm so glad that you're doing it. In economics, I don't think there's an appreciation of the difference between AI and a wrench. AI, it's not the same kind of technology. Like the way that this technology manifests in an economy is not the same than, say, a technology of a conveyor belt or something that requires a human agent to run, right? Like the way that that's going to have deflationary impacts, unemployment impacts is very different than a technology of which you set it in, forget it. So likewise, is there a transformation in the way in a development through history, once there's the arising of a technology that can change the necessity of the human subject, that would then actually make them unlimited per se, but precisely in that unlimitedness, then they're kind of, all the stuff I was saying earlier, there's a kind of loss of freedom in that unlimitedness, because then they are carried by the very possibility of being able to transform their necessity as a subject to something that they don't want. That's the question I think about.
Okay, so with regards to history, first and foremost, we look back, it's us looking back at history. History is not looking back at itself.
Right.
So we already come with it with some sort of intention or some sort of idea or goal in mind. What is that? That is the thing that Hegel's interested in. And he thinks that what we're interested in history is not history as such, but ourselves.
Right.
How we came to be who we are. What led up to this moment. And it turns out that a lot of the answer is, part of the answer is yes, in history, but the other part, or maybe more of the answer, is right now, right? Why did we take the move to look back at history in the first place? Something is happening in our own circumstances that's prompted this. And so what the answer is for Hegel is going to be the standard answer he uses ultimately for everything, which is freedom.
Right.
We want to learn more about our freedom, how we came to be who we are, how we're making sense of ourselves in our own current world, this, I don't know, current political climate, geopolitical situation, technologies, yada, yada, right? We look to history to help us, to give us guidance, give us instruction, right? Because sort of we don't repeat it because that's boring. Now, Hegel and I think a lot of other wise philosophers draw the line at trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. So we can understand certain concepts and processes and try to outline how they lead to contradictions. This is extremely hard to do, especially for things that are living, such as animals, human beings, and especially human societies, human culture. And it becomes doubly wrong-headed to try to figure out, well, what's going to happen, so-and-so conditions occur, because you're working with, the toolkit you're working with is already something abstract, and then you're trying to determine what is yet to come, but you don't know what is to come, if it's going to come in that form, and what the actuality is going to be when it does arrive there. That's why the Owl of Minerva only rises at dusk. You can only think within your own historical circumstance, but you're thinking it in thoughts. There's the constant. It's thought itself, logic. So, going off on a thought experiment here, whatever the transhumanist ideal or attempt or project is, good luck trying to change logic. Right? So Kant, he has this idea of transcendental logic and general logic. Transcendental logic is what defines the kind of human experience we are having, right? But he can imagine there might be other creatures in the universe or whatever that could have different transcendental categories that makes it so that they have different experience. Maybe they see more of the light spectrum. Maybe they have a different idea of temporality or whatever, right? So there might be some leeway there. But are you gonna say like modus ponens isn't is not real, or to say identity, difference, contradiction, logic, and all these things? That becomes like the absolute hard limit and constraint.
Absolutely.
Right. And as far as Hegel is concerned, and many philosophers who do metaphysics in ontology, they want to understand that absolute framework and see how it works and informs their own living. But they cannot, it's not possible to imagine anything beyond that, a kind of thinking or experiencing apart from that, because it's logic. It's especially transhumanist, which is, I think, very focused on technology. Those technological things, computers, are the most logical things, but logical in the formal logical way, not logical in the sense of like living logical way. So yeah, you got general logic to deal with, and you're not going to be so free to change that, nor should you want to.
Right. No, this is a very good point you're making. So when I talked with Cadell about like the singularity and the dangers of the singularity and all these different things, Ray Kurzweil and all there was this notion that the singularity is precisely the moment when you realize that the singularity cannot be what you want it to be, precisely because there is an inescapable necessity to being, whether it be logic or some human element that you cannot escape. But the problem is that it's getting to that very moment required you to operate according to certain assumptions of what is possible that then makes you not able to handle that revelation. And thus it creates a massive pathology that can prove in a Derodian sense very apocalyptic. Because here you are and there it's there. So it's not where you literally, I should clarify, it's not where we literally gain the ability to escape all necessity, but that we head toward it. And as we head toward it and the technology suggests that we can head toward it, that creates a game theory dynamic that we try to, while trying to, makes us less and less prepared for when we eventually face the unavoidable reality that there are some things that you cannot fully escape, and that precisely that moment will be when you're not in any position to handle that at all, and therefore the response can be very pathological on an individual level, on a social level, on a global level. Now, I know that's very big picture, and so that's kind of the question that arises, which to me complexifies how I think about, because I'm never a fan at all of, say, making something illegal, like, when you say, oh, you can't have a computer because you could use it for bad things or whatever, right? So the notion, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of, say, making AI technology illegal or banning it across the planet or something like that, precisely because that would destroy the process of working out the good and the bad. Just like you say, because things bring good and bad, or gene technology. But what's interesting is thinking about these technologies working on the subject at such a profound level that they create very extended periods of time of living in a plausible deniability of there being any sort of necessity to the human being, that then when the day comes where you no longer can deny that, you're really not ready for it at all. And the pathological responses could be very vast. So I don't know. That's kind of an open question that I think about. But what you're saying is you're exactly right. There eventually is, whether it be logic or something, necessity that cannot be avoided. And so, no, technology cannot overcome that. But can it condition us toward it, that when we are forced to confront that, it has very bad consequences? Don't know, but that could be risking the prediction of the future or different things like that.
So, I have to confess ignorance, because I don't know what singularity means in this case.
I'm so sorry.
So what I'm thinking is, it's already here. You and me,
Sure.
we're singular, right?
Sure.
My dad, any human being are singularities, and they're bloody lethal.
Right.
Have you seen the wars we've done with each other?
Yes, that's right.
Human history ever?
Yes.
We're perfectly capable of traumatizing and molesting and ruining ourselves.
Sure.
Many times over, without. So I don't see like the fear of what's to come in the future that isn't already as bad as we have been doing towards each other. Maybe it's going to be in a more nefarious way, and like subtle ways. Maybe that's something to look out for. But then again, I see that that's also been going on amongst us.
Oh no,
so we can be very bad with each other. So you tell me, what is the
the singularity is the notion that technological advancement is an exponential curve where it goes very slowly, but then when you get to a certain point, it starts to accelerate so unbelievably quick that you really can't keep up with it. So for example, like the world between 1901 and 2001, there's radical shifts between those changes. And then the argument is the amount of change that will occur between 2000 and 2050 is as much as took 100 years to happen. And then between 2015 and 2075, and it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks till you get to the point, because of the computer processing technology and the different things, that the amount of change is just unbelievable. And that will open the possibilities for humans to change themselves genetically, psychologically, mentally, on basically all levels. And that will have all those impacts. So that's the idea. Yeah. I don't disagree with you at all. That and nobody like Kurzweil or whatever, they would absolutely say that you're already in the singularity. It's just further, coming out, if you will. You could say it's the implicit being made explicit. And there's basically no way to avoid it. There's a way in which there's that movement that will be occurring. So that's what he means by it.
Okay. There's been a lot of development, innovations and so on the past 100 years, and it's all grown exponentially. But despite that, I'm just fascinated by how so much is the same.
Oh, sure. Sure.
We still have the sexual desires. We still like to get drunk. We still like to do things we're not supposed to do. We still do stupid stuff. We still, make mistakes. We get naive about things. People go out gambling. People sell heroin. Like, so some of the stuff, a lot of it seems so much the same. So this makes me posit that there are some eternal jobs that we have that it's just going to be part of us for a long time because of the self-conscious creatures we are. And our freedom is that we can make it more explicit to ourselves. But I wonder if, there will be things that we cannot abdicate ourselves from.
100%. I mean, basically, Cadell and I, like, our whole, like, what we were talking about is the notion that there is, in fact, against what the transhumanists say, which basically suggests there is nothing about human beings that cannot be transformed. You know, we're saying, no, 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 no. I mean, there are things about the human being that are constant and cannot be done away with. And in fact, if you try, what will end up happening is forcing to realize that, because Hegel is right on that. And you are not going to be prepared for that revelation. And as a result, the consequences will not be good. You will not be prepared for that because you will have
all the better.
All the better. Like,
all the better. Yeah.
You know,
I mean, whoever is ever prepared to do philosophy, it's a traumatizing experience because you're jolted out of your naive, comforting idea of what reality is, and you're thrown into this, you know, uncertainty. But that is good.
If there is something about philosophy that is thinking about thinking, that then comes to say eventually leads you to a point, or one part of it is the realization that limit is good. Limit has a certain freeing element to it, that it actually is part of what makes you human and able to operate. Well, then being forced to acknowledge that because of the way the world develops toward the singularity would not be traumatizing. It would not be something that you're not ready for. And in fact, you'd be like, yes, of course, this is exactly the case. But if the human subject does not have that idea, if they are not ready for that, if there actually is, if we go back to the picture example, if there actually is a bigger picture there that you're not ready to see, and you haven't done the work to see it per se, then what happens when you see it? What is the response to people? How do they act? Do they turn to totalitarianism because they're overwhelmed by the the possibility of the singularity? Do they make a scapegoat out of China? Do they turn to atomization because they want to avoid experiencing other people that make them reflect on their own choices? All of those are things that I think tend to be the response when you encounter that undeniable, at that point, it's undeniable that there's, at the point of the singularity or approaching it, the more you approach the singularity, the more it becomes undeniable that there are things about human beings that cannot be changed, that are always the case, exactly on what you're saying. You're either ready for that realization or you're not. And if you're ready for that realization, then you can respond to it in a manner that does not say prove pathological or problematic or turn to totalitarianism or isolate yourself or different things, which to me goes to show why philosophy can have a good role, right? Because you're ready for experiencing that. You're ready for being forced to see that there's actually something liberating in necessity. Where, again, no one is saying that, I'm not trying to predict literally when the singularity is, what it will look like. You know, my whole thing, the whole problem with a lot of the transhumanism is that they are predicting how humans will respond to the singularity in a very positive way, you know, in a way that actually it will be good, and so on and so forth, without taking, they're not seeing the destabilizing potential in the singularity that has to be taken very, very seriously. And if you take that seriously, then it contingently can be a good thing, but it, you know, also could be a bad thing, depending on, you know, one's preparedness to it. So, you know, that to me, and also too, I wanted to add, like on the game theory, and now I've kept you for 2 hours and 30 minutes because you're great, is that there's almost a way for me, you know, because precisely where philosophies warn you that you can't predict history, if you gain the ability that you can't predict the future, if you gain the ability to predict the future, that means there probably isn't a future. Exactly. You know, there probably isn't a future, because that would mean in order to accurately predict the future, you will have to remove the indeterminacy element from human life to such a manner that would ultimately remove the human. So there's an irony where gaining the ability to predict the future is assurance there isn't one, or that it's not one you want. And so to me, actually, I guess this is what I'm saying. The more, this I guess the point I'm getting at, the more that we can confidently say we know what the future will look like because of game theory and technology is actually precisely evidence that we are in trouble. The more and more these technologies give us the ability to, say, map out what is probably going to occur in geopolitics and different things, this is actually bad. Because as we all know, it's not that humans can't try to predict the future. The problem is that they do try to predict the future, and that creates all of the issues we've described. Well, the more and more we create technologies that make us very confident or feel that we can predict the future, that must mean those very technologies are changing human beings in a manner that makes them more determined and less indeterminate, which means that you're removing the human element from history. So that would mean that the future that you're predicting, the very prediction of the future is evidence that you're not going to have one because of the way that it changes how the humans operate. And so there's kind of an irony I see in that.
Right. I see. Okay. Yeah. I agree when you say that, if we were able to predict the future, there wouldn't be one. But I don't see that as, the same thing as we are trying to make models and predict the future and so on.
Sure.
Right. That is not at all closing the future. But I think you're right that it does say something about ourselves and our society and our culture and the way human beings are right now, that we're so obsessed about figuring things out, making models and so on.
Oh, no, and I should clarify, I don't mean to say that we can literally predict the future. It's like the more we try to approach it, the more, or that we think we can, the more that is an unhealthy, let's say it's an unhealthy relationship.
Yeah, but on the other hand, we are trying to figure out certain habits, systems, ways of living and being, which are, rational and good, and try to remove those that, eliminate those that aren't, like, getting addicted.
Right.
Not good. Plain and simple. Right. And it's, it's a rubbish thing to experience, and it's very hard, right, but it's rationally, not good at all.
Right.
And there is something there we can understand, and so you can see the pattern and predict, oh yeah, if you keep on doing this and this so and so with that substance, yeah, wherever you're going to go, it's not going to be a good place. All right. So there are these ways in which I think prediction regarding habits and systems and so on are very useful and needed, right? But the game, I think, alters substantially when we take it up to a level of, society and nations and, worldwide technology. It is, as you put it, with regards to history, right? Focusing in on a local thing, the sardine factory in my hometown. Yeah, it's very crisp and clear. We can, get a. But if you try to, make a sense out of World War II, so many factors and things at play, right? So I see it a little bit like that, with the way you put it with regards to history. That if we think of a system in a, higher complexity, as such as, the human society, or even the a human society, it's going to be a lot of vagueness and things you're just going to have to take for granted. So with regards to something you were saying as well, I am both more pessimistic and more optimistic, because I think if you can prepare somebody adequately to meet whatever challenge it is they're going to meet, or to, make ready for whatever is coming, and so that they don't get traumatized or suffer or whatever, right? Then it means they're already there.
Sure.
Right. So I see that as, the same thing you said with, if we were able to predict the future, seems like there's a bit of the same logic occurring there.
Yes.
Maybe that was your intention, because in preparing yourself to meet so-and-so, you're already there. And so
yes,
you are really not preparing yourself to anything other than where you are right now.
Yes.
That might have been your intention, meaning, but I think that, you will never be ready.
Sure.
And that might be a pessimistic thing, but I also think that, well, you'll still manage, you'll still meet whatever it is you're not ready for, make mistakes, suffer, and learn from it. You will fall in love, and might not work out. You will have your heart broken, but it's not going to be the end of it. So I think that people are really can be very durable and creative as regards to the things they are facing. So that's my thoughts about with regards to that.
Absolutely. And, I'll start bringing us to a close as we approach hour 3, and, give you a chat, and we'll have another talk because everyone should know that the point was to talk about Philippe's class, but I enjoy speaking with him so much that, this has been really magnificent. I really appreciate it. So Philippe is indeed doing a class on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which is magnificent. And I'll have a list of questions next time to
the
follow.
blame goes both ways.
You're a good man. You're a good man.
We just get carried away with
it's a good
wisdom's
thing.
delights.
But all the more reason for people to take your class, because they'll get carried away and enjoy it, as you've clearly exhibited the spirit of that muse. So I appreciate that very much. I would say that absolutely, when I'm talking about kind of avoiding pathology requires facing pathology ahead of time. Like, you prepare for like marriage, for example, like one wants to have other friends and relationships and knows other people, say, before they go into the intensity of, say, a marriage situation where you're with someone who's different, has different things. There's a way friendship and being in society prepares one for entering into, say, a marriage on that level of an intensity. I'm not saying it's impossible to, say, go from isolation to marriage, but there's a way in which there's a preparedness. In the same way that, say, going to...
And one of those things today is make a YouTube channel.
Yeah, sure. There you go. Where you meet people. Exactly. Yeah. So no, and so there's definitely something where philosophy is preparing you, to use that element of trauma. Absolutely. It's preparing you for trauma by traumatizing you in ways that doesn't break you, you could say. Like, philosophy is like, how do we, of course, it's hard to know how to do that because who can handle what, but there's this kind of there's this idea of how do you expose someone to reality in a manner that disillusions them, but not so quickly and so all at once that then they just enter into a kind of hopeless nihilism or something like that, right? Like, I'm not going to have my son, I'm going to force my child to realize that when he says he has a good day, that there's an infinity in that very statement, but I'm not going to introduce him to Nietzsche yet until he's at least 12 or something, right? There's certain levels that you introduce, not because you're planning, it's not because you're saying, oh, I'm never going to give it to them, but because there are stages where actually understanding the infinity of a grain of sand makes them able to handle the greater philosophers and the greater where they can then take it and develop with it. But there is pain along the way, just not, it's like going to the gym. You don't want, if you only lift 20-pound dumbbells, you don't want to jump all the way to 70. You want to go from 20 to 30. It hurts more than the 20s. And then you go to the 40 and the 50. And then the whole reason you're doing that is to get to the 70s. But if you go straight to the 70s, you may actually literally hurt your arms as opposed to just break them down. And you might get hurt and you might just get like hopeless, right? You mean like, I'll never do, what's the point anyway? And then you give up. So absolutely, the development I'm trying to describe is this almost, I want to say, training through failure. You put that very well, where in Hegel, there's this movement through failure and difficulty. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. So, I mean, the gym analogy is one I favor myself, because like our bodies, right? If you want to get stronger, you have to give yourself adequate challenge, but not too much, because then you actually hurt yourself.
Yes.
And in a similar way, Hegel does the same thing in his books, the way he structures, right? He starts with the simplest, most primitive element, and make sure that everybody can be on board with that.
Right.
Yes. So we start with sensuous certainty. Everybody can be on board. That you think this is there? Yep. Okay. I think that's the ultimate reality. That's the truth. Okay. Let's see what's on with this and unpack that. And it's going to turn out that the truth is going to be something more, something else, something unexpected.
That's right.
But we start off from something that everybody can jump into, and this connects back to Socrates, the way he was doing things too. Because whenever he was getting his, dealing with his interlocutors, he would get them to say things. But then he would have like, yeah, what do you mean? I don't know. But he would look for a common point. Right. He would look for a common thing and get them to agree with it.
That's right.
Because unless you have this, you're just like two bricks, right? In different things. I have my idea, theories, whatever, and you have yours. And we might, spew stuff at each other, but there won't really be a dialogue. There won't really be a kind of communication between the two. But it does require to have this common base, and then go stepwise from there. Now, in the case of Hegel, it goes really exponentially like this, right? And then it actually bends around and starts go into itself, right? Which, there might actually break you, unfortunately, but yeah.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But then at that point, you
But
realize,
yeah,
you know, that
yeah,
that's a good thing, actually. Like at that point that you are conditioned as a being, like if you're able to get there and handle it, you go, oh, wait, that kind of breaking actually has a sublimative element to it, right? But then it's getting there, to get to that place that's very important.
yeah. And as we start out with, it can't be too hard. It has to be simple.
That's right. Well, and the thing to me, like you were saying with Hegel starting on sense certainty, and saying we can agree, right? Like that, we may not agree that what this laptop has on it, but we can agree that there's some colors and shape and, go on and so forth. We see today what ends up happening when you try to tell people about historic events or what occurred when they don't share the foundation. They say, oh, well, that's just what the biased conservative historians say or liberal conservatives say. Like there's all this fake truth, no one believes anything or anything. The genius of Hegel is giving a historic account based on the very bedrock, starting with sense certainty of the subject and going from there. Whereas now we just say, we try to base it, it's almost like we try to have authority and experts play the role of sense certainty. And don't get me wrong, I think this anti-expert, anti-institution vibe that defines especially American politics is very dangerous. You don't want a world, because it's kind of just relativistic. It's one thing to oppose authoritarianism. It's another thing to oppose expertise, like someone who's put in the time and done the work and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's a very different thing. But
yeah, well, it's a bit strange as well, because people usually have these things about very political sensitive issues, but they don't question the expertise of your plumber.
Right.
That debate doesn't go that direction, or electrician, or the carpenters building the house. No, it's more intellectual matters.
That's right.
So yes, those things invite more criticism of expertise. Right. But at the same time, there also is real expertise, as you were saying.
That
right. Needs to be developed. It needs to be educated, right? People have to go to universities to get degrees to qualify to do the kind of jobs that they're doing in those positions, and so on and so forth.
No, I completely agree. And and again, the genius of Hegel is.
Oh yes, let me just correct you. It's not a historical development. It's logical development.
Sure. Yes.
But one that is grounded in how phenomena appears to consciousness.
Very fair. Very fair.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That is
absolutely.
how I would cash it out. Right.
No, I completely agree. But what's so interesting is by doing that, then actually there's a reliable, like there's a way that it's kind of reliable, whereas it's not susceptible to the same critiques that you see a lot of people in modern politics today throwing out, because it's appealing to, like you said, we're going to start with your sense certainty and go from there and to see.
Yeah. We will start with that because it's logically the simplest shape of consciousness, Hegel thinks, and that everybody can be on board with that. Absolutely. But it's not a historical thing in the sense that it happened at some point, and at a certain point it didn't happen.
Sure. Absolutely.
This is also, the benefit of these kinds of accounts.
Absolutely.
Whereas historical accounts are like X happened at time Y,
sequence,
and there'll be people like, no, it didn't. Something else happened at that time, or something else followed, and so on and so forth.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and again, if we're trying to turn history into a sequence as opposed to entailing sequence, condition, and development, not to get into all that, well, then you have those debates like, no, it went this way and this so forth. And then you think you can model the future and stuff doesn't go so great. So it's really important to have those distinctions. But Filip, I've enjoyed this immensely. Can you tell everyone the date of your class? So when does your class start so everybody knows and everyone needs to take it?
Thanks so much. You're very generous. So the course starts October 16th.
Wonderful.
That's when there will be the first seminar, and there'll be 9 of those. We'll meet weekly. We'll have a reading week break to give people a chance to think about their presentations or just get a breather. It's more likely the case. Yeah, 16th October. It's going to be a lot of fun. I really look forward to it.
Absolutely.
There's been a lot of interest in the course, and I'm really happy to see that.
Oh, there should be a lot. If you're teaching, there should be a lot of interest. Well,
you're far too generous. Thank you.
Well, these conversations have been such a joy, and it is a delight to meet someone such as yourself and to speak on these matters like this. And I appreciate your time. The 3 hours went just like that. We will talk again.
Usually does in the realm of thought.
The magic of it, right? And next time
becomes relevant.
It's yes. So I'd love to do it again and to really speak. So we have till October to get, so we'll do it again. I've really enjoyed this. And again, congratulations on the work that you're doing.
Congratulations likewise to your Enter the Alien.
Well, I appreciate
collection.
Well, I appreciate it, my friend.
I've edited a journal, so I know editing can be a thankless job.
Well, I appreciate it. So I salute you. And the other thing I finally got your copy of your poem.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Dang.
Yes, I did. You see, the other thing I want to interrogate you on is some of these. So the next time we talk, well, maybe the fourth time we talk, I'm looking forward to that. Beautiful prose. My goodness. I've really enjoyed the. I really like poetry. I really appreciate people who have taken on the art form. I also appreciate poetry that is considering, I like to call them ontological stakes, like, not just, but like really the big matters, which you mentioned, Blake. I always like Coleridge, Blake, a lot of the romantic poets. I also like Ashbery, Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot, different ones. And it's not the case that a lot of the new poetry that comes out falls in that tradition that I long for and miss, but yours does. So I really appreciate it. It does.
That's
so
really, I feel very touched and honored for you.
Well, I appreciate it because that's some of my favorite work. And like I said, there is something about the great poets and great poetry that does in fact transform the way that you experience the world and you carry yourself in the world. So it is very good to have someone who is working in that way to do that kind of work, because that makes a big difference. So thank you for doing that, Filip.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I really feel like poetry is a transformative activity.
Yes.
As you do it, right? As you write it, as you poeticize, and it's I personally feel like I'm a paradoxically split being, right? Because I can't do it in what I do in poetry and philosophy. It's illegal, right? I can't go off on the rails like I can in the poetry.
Yes.
So I I split myself up, and I do in philosophy. I follow very rigorously, technically, the demands of the concept, the argument and demonstration. Fine, I'll do it. But then I go wild in the poetry. There I just let it go.
No, I'm this. Michelle and I, our big thing. It's funny you say that because the main thing we did with Turn the World, black novels, short. We have short stories, different things, and actually that split, I think, is what kind of helps. There's a way that it helps them both, and it has a special way of impacting how you carry yourself in the world, because that is a kind of habit forming of being a dare I say dialectical kind of being, where you see that they inform one another, but they do so because they are kept different, and that different.
I think that's very good. It's very well put.
And so I appreciate. I think that the fact that you have held that dialectical tension so well comes out in your work and in your work in philosophy. So I appreciate that very much, Filip. So
thanks, Daniel. That's really great to hear.
Well,
thank you so much.
Appreciate it. We'll talk again, my friend. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Filip. Appreciate it. Thank you, Filip.
You have a great day, Daniel.
You too, Filip. I appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Good luck with the garden. Don't
yes,
forget
sir.
to do
I need it. I'm going to go fight the deer. Thank you, Filip.